2,000 years ago, a bolt of silk from China could pass through the hands of dozens of traders, cross deserts, mountains, and seas, and eventually arrive in a Roman marketplace, its maker never knowing who would wear it or what coins would pay for it. Along that journey, ideas, technologies, and religions traveled with equal persistence. From the farmlands of the Yellow River to the ports of the Mediterranean, the web of connections we now call the Silk Road reshaped the course of world history. This was never a single road, nor solely about silk. It was a shifting network of caravan trails, river crossings, and sea lanes that operated for centuries, linking the lives of nomads, merchants, monks, and emperors. Empires rose to protect and profit from it. Others fought to control it. Goods moved, but so did languages, faiths, and even diseases. In this documentary, we will follow the Silk Road from its earliest, almost invisible beginnings in prehistoric exchange to its reinvention in the 21st century. We will see how geography dictated its paths, how politics and war shaped its fortunes, and how the people who lived along it left a legacy that still connects continents today. The Silk Road is not only a story of trade, it is a story of how the world became interconnected long before the modern age, long before the first bolt of Chinese silk ever left the looms. And centuries before anyone coined the phrase Silk Road, people were already moving goods, skills, and ideas across Eurasia. These earliest exchanges were not part of a grand organized trade system. There were no mapped routes or fixed markets, no imperial armies guarding caravans. Instead, there were seasonal paths across grasslands, tracks through deserts, and trails over mountain passes. They were used by herders, hunters, miners, and farmers who moved what they had in exchange for what they needed. Over many generations, these simple exchanges created the foundations on which the later Silk Road would be built. By around 3000 BCE, large regions of Eurasia were already home to settled farming communities and mobile herding societies. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus, and later China, agriculture supported growing populations and increasingly complex societies. Beyond the plowed fields, in the vast Eurasian steppe, pastoralist groups raised sheep, goats, and cattle. These grasslands stretched thousands of kilometers from the Black Sea to Mongolia, offering a highway of open terrain for anyone who knew how to live from it. Herders moved their animals with the seasons, and over time they became the first to link distant ecological zones, trading meat, hides, and wool for grain, metals, and crafted goods from farming neighbors. The earliest known long-distance exchanges in Central Asia often involved rare and valuable materials. From the high mountains of what is now Afghanistan came lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone prized for jewelry and inlays in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Archaeologists have found beads of this stone in tombs as far west as the Nile and as far east as the Yellow River Basin, suggesting a chain of exchanges that spanned thousands of kilometers. From the deserts of Central Asia and Iran came turquoise and carnelian. From the distant Altai and Tian Shan mountains came jade that would later be cherished in China. These goods did not travel in a single leap from one end of Eurasia to the other. Instead, they passed from hand to hand, village to village, and camp to camp. One group might trade stone for copper, another might swap copper for grain, yet another might exchange the grain for crafted ornaments. This relay trade was slow but steady, and it worked because every link in the chain gained something it valued. Metals were among the most transformative items moving along these early paths. Around the 3rd millennium BCE, the ability to smelt copper and tin into bronze spread through western and central Eurasia. In places like the Altai region and the Kopet Dag Mountains, rich mineral deposits drew miners and traders. Bronze weapons, tools, and ornaments moved far from their sources, and the skills to make them moved as well. Metal technology gave certain groups military advantages, which in turn could allow them to dominate trade routes or demand tribute from neighbors. By the 2nd millennium BCE, the steppe was home to a new invention that would change mobility forever: the horse-drawn chariot. The earliest chariots seem to have emerged in the Sintashta culture, in what is now the southern Urals. sometime around the early 2nd millennium BCE. Lightweight wooden frames, spoked wheels, and teams of horses made it possible to travel faster and farther than before. Chariots were first a tool of war, but they also helped spread horse breeding, riding skills, and wheeled transport across much of Eurasia. The horse itself became one of the most valuable commodities of the steppe, sought by settled kingdoms to enhance their armies and prestige. The domestication of the Bactrian camel, with its 2 humps and ability to endure cold, arid climates, added another layer of connectivity. Likely domesticated in Central Asia around the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, this animal could carry heavy loads over long distances and survive in environments where horses and donkeys struggled. Camels would eventually become the backbone of desert caravans, but even in these early centuries, they enabled the linking of distant oases across the Iranian plateau and Central Asian basins. The geography of these exchanges was shaped by natural corridors and barriers. The vast Eurasian steppe offered easy passage for those accustomed to nomadic life, while mountain ranges like the Pamirs, Tian Shan, and Altai posed difficult obstacles. Deserts such as the Taklamakan and Karakum could only be crossed via strings of oases where water, pasture, and shelter were available. These environmental constraints forced early traders and travelers to follow certain paths repeatedly. Over time, these paths became recognized routes, remembered in oral traditions, and passed down from one generation to the next. By around the 1st millennium BCE, the scale of interregional exchange was increasing. The spread of iron technology from the Near East into Central Asia brought stronger tools and weapons, fueling both agricultural expansion and warfare. This period also saw the emergence of more organized political structures among nomadic groups, such as the Scythians in the western steppe and related cultures farther east. These groups controlled vast grazing lands and could influence who had access to certain routes. They often acted as intermediaries between distant farming civilizations, moving goods quickly on horseback and demanding payment for safe passage. The importance of these early exchanges was not limited to material goods. Languages, artistic styles, and even religious ideas began to diffuse along these pathways. Decorative motifs from the Near East have been found on objects in the Altai. Weaving patterns from Central Asia appear in the Caucasus. Knowledge of medicinal plants, mining techniques, and animal husbandry also traveled with the people who moved between regions. The movement of people, whether by migration, seasonal travel, or marriage alliances, helped knit together a patchwork of cultures long before any single empire claimed to rule them. Archaeological finds illustrate the human dimension of this exchange. In burial mounds across Kazakhstan and southern Siberia, archaeologists have uncovered goods from faraway lands. Beads of Mediterranean glass, bronze mirrors from China, and textiles dyed with indigo. These items were not everyday possessions. They were symbols of status and connection, proof that their owners or their communities had access to distant networks. The presence of such goods in graves suggests that participation in long-distance exchange was not merely economic. It was social and political as well. It is important to remember that these routes were fragile. A shift in climate, the movement of hostile tribes, or the collapse of a neighboring society could disrupt the flow of goods. Without a centralized authority to maintain security, traders relied on alliances, shared customs, and personal reputation. Trust was as important as physical skill in navigating harsh terrain. The knowledge of where to find water, when to cross a mountain pass, or which local group to gift in order to pass safely could mean the difference between survival and ruin. By the end of this long prehistoric and early historic phase, much of the infrastructure, both physical and social, that would later underpin the Silk Road was already in place. Regular paths linked steppe, desert, and mountain zones. Domesticated animals capable of long-distance travel were available. Communities had learned the value of exotic goods and the means to move them through a chain of exchanges. Cultural connections stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to the fringes of China, even if no one at the time could see the full extent of that web. When silk finally appeared in Western markets, it entered into this older, well-established network. The merchants, Herders and caravan leaders who carried it were heirs to centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to move precious goods across vast and dangerous landscapes. In that sense, the Silk Road did not begin with silk at all. It began with these first quiet links between distant peoples. By the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, the scattered paths of Eurasia began to be shaped by something new: imperial power. Among the earliest and most influential of these powers was the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which at its height stretched from the Aegean Sea in the west to the Indus Valley in the east. Under rulers such as Cyrus the Great, Cambyses, and Darius I, the Persians developed a vast administrative system that not only held together a multicultural empire, but also transformed travel and trade. At the heart of this transformation was the creation of the Royal Road, a network of well-maintained routes that connected distant corners of the empire in ways never before seen. When Cyrus the Great founded the empire in the mid-6th century before the Common Era, his conquests brought together regions that had previously been politically separate: the rich cities of Mesopotamia, the plateau of Iran, the mountains of Anatolia, and the fertile lands of Egypt. These regions had long histories of local and regional trade, but now, for the first time, they were joined under a single authority. This presented a challenge. Governing such a vast and diverse realm required reliable communication and the ability to move troops and officials quickly. Without that, the empire would fracture under its own weight. It was under Darius I, who came to power around the late 6th century before the Common Era, that the Royal Road took shape as an integrated system. Stretching for more than 2,000 kilometers from Susa in the Persian heartland to Sardis in western Anatolia, this main artery crossed mountains, rivers, and plateaus. It was supplemented by connecting routes leading to Babylon, Persepolis, and beyond, toward Central Asia and the Indus Valley. Unlike the informal tracks of earlier times, these roads were engineered and maintained by the state. Darius ordered way stations, known as caravanserais, to be built at regular intervals, offering fresh horses, food, and lodging. The primary goal of this road system was administrative efficiency. Couriers riding with official messages could travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of days, a journey that might take a private traveler several months. Herodotus, the Greek historian, famously noted that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course. This was not merely praise for speed. It was a recognition of the logistical innovation that allowed the Achaemenids to govern effectively. Messages that once took weeks or months to arrive could now be delivered with astonishing speed, enabling the central court to respond to rebellions, natural disasters, or foreign threats with unprecedented swiftness. The Royal Road was not a single paved highway in the modern sense. In some places, it was a hard-packed dirt path wide enough for carts. In others, it was a series of marked trails across open terrain. Bridges and ferries were constructed at major river crossings. In mountainous regions, the road was cut into slopes or supported by stone retaining walls. The important feature was not uniform construction but consistent maintenance. Imperial officials were charged with ensuring that the road remained passable and secure. Patrols kept watch for bandits, and the imperial authority guaranteed a measure of safety that encouraged more people to travel. This new level of stability transformed trade within the empire. Merchants could move goods more predictably, knowing that way stations offered rest and resupply. While the Achaemenid state did not itself operate long-distance commercial caravans, its infrastructure made such ventures more viable and profitable. Textiles from Mesopotamia, metals from Anatolia, wines from the Aegean, and spices from India could flow more easily between regions. The empire's standardized systems of weights and measures, along with the use of official Aramaic as a common administrative language, reduced the friction of doing business across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The Royal Road also facilitated the movement of people beyond merchants and messengers. Artisans traveled to royal building projects in Susa and Persepolis. Soldiers marched to distant garrisons. Scholars and physicians found work at courts far from their birthplaces. Religious ideas, too, moved along these routes. Zoroastrianism, the state religion promoted by the Achaemenid kings, spread more widely through the empire's infrastructure, while older Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Anatolian beliefs traveled in the opposite direction. The road's economic impact extended beyond the movement of luxury goods. Agricultural produce could be moved from surplus regions to areas suffering shortages, helping to stabilize food supplies. In times of famine or drought, this capacity could be the difference between recovery and collapse. Taxes collected in kind, grain, oil, or livestock, could be transported to imperial storehouses, sustaining the large standing army that underpinned Persian power. The royal road also had diplomatic consequences. The Achaemenid court maintained relations with client kings, vassal states, and distant allies, and the road allowed envoys to move quickly between capitals. When negotiations failed, the same routes could deliver armies. This dual purpose, supporting both peace and war, made the road a strategic asset in every sense. Yet the royal road was not without its limits. It primarily served the needs of the empire's heartlands and was most effective in regions under firm Persian control. Beyond its official termini, into the steppes of Central Asia or the deserts of Arabia, travel still depended on local guides and traditional knowledge. The Persians did not attempt to fully incorporate these more remote zones into their road network, relying instead on alliances, tribute arrangements, and occasional military expeditions. Still, the influence of the Achaemenid model reached beyond the empire's borders. Neighboring states observed the advantages of rapid communication and secure transport, and some adopted similar systems. Later empires, from the Seleucids to the Romans, would draw on Persian precedents when building their own roads and postal services. The concept of a state-managed long-distance route with stations, security, and standardized administration was now part of the political vocabulary of Eurasia. The royal road also connected the Achaemenid Empire indirectly to distant lands. Through Anatolia, it linked to Greek cities on the coast, where merchants and envoys could sail to the wider Mediterranean. Through the eastern satrapies, it brushed against the frontiers of Central Asia and India, touching the networks described in the previous section. Although the full overland transcontinental trade of later centuries did not yet exist, the building blocks were falling into place. Goods and ideas could now move more smoothly across an enormous swath of territory, carried in part by the infrastructure and administrative skill of the Persians. The decline of the royal road came with the fall of the Achaemenid Empire itself. In the late 4th century before the Common Era, Alexander of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great, invaded from the west, defeating the Persian armies and toppling the Achaemenid dynasty. His conquests would destroy some of the existing structures, but also carry forward certain elements, including the value of secure, well-maintained routes across vast distances. Under his successors, these routes would be reshaped, linking the Hellenistic world to the markets and cultures of Central Asia. The Persian achievement in creating the royal road was a turning point in the history of long-distance connection. It demonstrated how an empire could harness infrastructure to project power, sustain commerce, and weave together diverse peoples. Where earlier exchanges had depended on personal networks and local arrangements, the Achaemenid system imposed a framework that was larger than any single community. This would remain a central theme of Silk Road history: the interplay between political authority and the flow of goods, ideas, and people. When Alexander of Macedon crossed into Asia in the spring of the late 4th century before the Common Era, he carried with him an army trained in the tactics of the Greek phalanx, a talent for rapid campaigning, and an ambition to rule the known world. In a decade of relentless conquest, he dismantled the Achaemenid Empire, seized its capitals, and pushed far beyond the Persian frontier into Central Asia and India. Although his empire fractured soon after his death, the urban foundations he left behind would serve as important junctions in the emerging network of trans-Eurasian exchange. These cities, along with the political and cultural changes of the Hellenistic period, created a new kind of crossroads linking the Mediterranean, the Iranian Plateau, Central Asia, and parts of South Asia. The regions Alexander entered after defeating Darius III were not empty spaces awaiting civilization. Central Asia already had ancient agricultural oases, fortified towns, and trade routes connecting to both east and west. But the Macedonian conquest brought new political arrangements, new technologies, and a new cultural layer, the imprint of Greek language, art, and urban planning. Alexander founded or refounded a string of cities, often named Alexandria, in strategically chosen locations. In the region of Bactria and Sogdiana, roughly corresponding to parts of modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, these cities were placed near rivers, fertile valleys, and existing caravan paths. The purpose of these foundations was both military and economic. Garrisoned by Greek and Macedonian settlers, the cities secured the frontiers and acted as bases for further campaigning. At the same time, they became centers for trade, administration, and cultural exchange. Streets were laid out in grids, public spaces included agoras and theaters, and Greek became a language of governance alongside local tongues. Over time, these settlements attracted merchants, artisans, and farmers from surrounding areas, creating multi-ethnic communities in which Greek and local traditions mingled. After Alexander's death in Babylon in the year 323 before the Common Era, his generals, the Diadochi, fought for control over the vast territories he had conquered. Central Asia eventually came under the authority of the Seleucid Empire, founded by Seleucus I Nicator. The Seleucids maintained many of the cities established by Alexander and encouraged trade through their eastern territories. Yet the sheer distance from their capitals in Syria made direct control over Bactria and Sogdiana difficult. Governors in these regions began to operate with considerable autonomy, and by the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom had emerged as an independent power. The Greco-Bactrian kingdom thrived in part because of its position at the intersection of multiple trade routes. To the south lay the passes into India, to the east the approaches toward the Tarim Basin, and to the west the Iranian plateau leading to Mesopotamia. Greek coinage from Bactria has been found as far away as China, while Central Asian products such as war horses and jade found their way into Mediterranean markets. The kingdom's rulers, including Euthydemus I and Demetrius I, minted coins bearing both Greek inscriptions and local motifs, signaling a blend of identities aimed at appealing to diverse subjects and trading partners. Art and architecture from this period show a similar synthesis. In the region of Gandhara, south of the Hindu Kush, Greek artistic styles blended with local and Indian traditions to produce distinctive forms, such as realistic stone sculptures of the Buddha with flowing robes and wavy hair in the manner of Greek statuary. This Greco-Buddhist art would later influence depictions of the Buddha across much of Asia. Urban centers became sites where ideas, religions, and aesthetics could meet, adapt, and spread along the same routes that carried goods. One reason these cities functioned as effective crossroads was their stability relative to the surrounding steppe and mountain zones. The fortified nature of the settlements provided security for caravans, while the presence of markets and storage facilities allowed merchants to trade or restock. Greek-speaking administrators, often working with local partners, could enforce contracts and resolve disputes. This level of organization encouraged long-distance traders to incorporate these urban hubs into their itineraries. However, the Greco-Bactrian kingdom was not isolated from the turbulent politics of its neighbors. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, pressure from nomadic groups migrating from the north and east, possibly linked to the movement of the Yuezhi people, destabilized the region. These migrations were part of a larger reshuffling of peoples in Inner Asia, which in turn was influenced by conflicts farther east involving the Xiongnu Confederation. The Greco-Bactrian rulers faced repeated incursions, and while some responded with military campaigns, others sought alliances through trade and diplomacy. The weakening of the Greco-Bactrian state eventually led to its fragmentation. In the south, Greek rulers expanded into northern India, forming the Indo-Greek kingdoms that would rule parts of the Punjab and beyond. In the north, Bactria itself was overtaken by the Yuezhi, who would later establish the Kushan Empire. Despite the political shifts, many of the cities founded in the Hellenistic period continued to function as important trade and cultural centers. retaining elements of their Greek heritage even as they adapted to new rulers. The Hellenistic presence in Central Asia left a lasting impact on the Silk Road's development. The network of cities provided fixed points of stability and commerce in regions where nomadic mobility and shifting alliances often made trade unpredictable. The Greek emphasis on coinage, contracts, and market regulation influenced local practices, while the artistic and architectural styles that emerged from this cultural blending would travel far along the trade routes. Even after the political dominance of the Greek-speaking elites waned, the urban infrastructure they created remained integral to the flow of goods and ideas. The historian Strabo, writing in the early 1st century before the Common Era, described the region of Bactria as the ornament of all Asia because of its fertility and the wealth of its cities. This reputation had been built in large part during the Hellenistic centuries, when Greek-founded settlements acted as both cultural beacons and logistical anchors in the heart of Eurasia. By the late 2nd century before the Common Era, the stage was set for a new kind of connection between East and West. In China, the Han Dynasty was rising to power and looking beyond its borders for both allies and valuable resources. The movements of the Yuezhi and other nomadic groups, which had played a role in reshaping Central Asia, would soon bring the Chinese court into contact with regions once influenced by Greek settlers. The opening of formal diplomatic and trade missions from China toward Central Asia would mark the beginning of a new phase in the history of Eurasian exchange, one in which silk itself would become a key player. By the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, a new power in the far east of Eurasia began looking outward. The Han Dynasty, which had replaced the short-lived Qin in China, was consolidating its control over the Yellow River heartland and the southern reaches of the Yangtze Basin. Under Emperor Wu, known to later generations as Han Wudi, the court began to expand its influence far beyond the Great Wall. The driving forces behind this expansion were both political and economic, but at the heart of the story was a quest for horses and allies that would change the shape of transcontinental exchange. For much of the early Han period, the empire faced a serious threat from the Xiongnu, a powerful confederation of steppe nomads to the north. The Xiongnu dominated the eastern steppes, moving swiftly on horseback and conducting raids deep into Chinese territory. They also controlled important trade routes in the northwest, cutting the Han off from potential allies in Central Asia. Emperor Wu, determined to weaken the Xiongnu and secure the frontiers, needed both superior cavalry and political partners to the west. Horses were central to this strategy. While the Han had their own native breeds, these were smaller and less suited for sustained campaigning on the open steppe. Reports reached the court of a remarkable breed in the far west, in a place called Dayuan, known in later histories as Fergana. These heavenly horses, as Chinese sources called them, were larger, stronger, and faster than anything bred in China. They could carry heavily armed riders over long distances and were said to sweat blood, perhaps a poetic description of their stamina or a reference to a parasitic condition. Emperor Wu believed that obtaining these horses would give his armies the edge against the Xiongnu. The challenge was that Daiwan lay far beyond territories known to the Han. Reaching it would require crossing lands under Xiongnu influence and venturing into regions about which the Chinese knew little. To open this path, the emperor turned to an ambitious young courtier named Zhang Qian. In the year 138 before the Common Era, Zhang was sent west with a small party to seek an alliance with the Yuezhi, a nomadic people who had once lived in Gansu but had been driven westward by the Xiongnu decades earlier. The hope was that the Yuezhi, now settled somewhere in Central Asia, might join the Han in a pincer movement against their common enemy. Zhang Qian's mission was both daring and dangerous. Shortly after leaving Han territory, he was captured by the Xiongnu and held for more than a decade. Eventually, he escaped and continued his journey westward, crossing unfamiliar lands and passing through a series of Central Asian states and oases. When he finally found the Yuezhi in the fertile lands of Bactria, he discovered that they were no longer a nomadic force eager for revenge. They had settled into an agricultural life and were uninterested in launching a war against the Xiongnu. Even though the alliance failed, Zhang Qian's journey was a turning point in history. He returned to China with detailed reports on the geography, economies, and cultures of Central Asia. He described fertile river valleys, well-built cities, and markets filled with goods from many lands. He identified Taiwan and its prized horses, the rich states of Fergana, Sogdiana, and Bactria, and the routes that connected them to India and the Mediterranean world. His accounts provided the Han court with its first reliable picture of the regions beyond the immediate steppe frontier. Armed with this intelligence, Emperor Wu launched military campaigns to secure a corridor through the Hexi region and into the Tarim Basin. This area, dotted with oases such as Dunhuang, Turfan, and Khotan, became the gateway for Han expeditions and traders heading west. By establishing control over these oases, the Han could bypass Xiongnu-controlled routes and open direct contact with Central Asian states. Garrisons were built, administrative offices set up, and supply depots stocked to support both troops and caravans. The quest for the heavenly horses reached its climax in the so-called War of the Heavenly Horses. In the late 2nd century before the Common Era, Han forces marched into Fergana, enduring difficult sieges and harsh conditions. Eventually, Dayuan agreed to supply the Han with a number of these prized animals each year, cementing a trade relationship that would have strategic and symbolic value. Horses became not just a military asset but also a prestige item at the Han court, a sign of imperial reach and power. The opening of the western regions under Emperor Wu had effects that went far beyond cavalry. Once the Han secured the Hexi corridor and parts of the Tarim Basin, merchants began to travel along these routes, carrying silk, lacquerware, iron tools, and other Chinese goods. In return, they brought back not only horses but also grapes, alfalfa, walnuts, and new forms of metalwork. Cultural contacts expanded, and the Han court began to encounter foreign envoys from as far away as Parthia. One of the most important outcomes of Zhang Qian's mission was the establishment of permanent Han interest in Central Asia. While earlier Chinese dynasties had interacted with neighboring nomads, the Han now pursued a deliberate policy of expansion, diplomacy, and trade deep into the West. This policy required military investment, but it also led to the growth of diplomatic exchange. The Han sent gifts and envoys to distant rulers, and in turn received embassies from Central Asian states, some of whom brought exotic animals, precious stones, and unfamiliar textiles. The economic dimension of this opening was significant. Silk, which had long been valued within China, began to appear in foreign markets in greater quantities. Central Asian intermediaries carried it onward, exchanging it for goods that moved ever farther west. At the same time, the Han gained access to products from India and the Mediterranean via indirect trade. The routes that developed in this period were still fragmented. Goods might change hands many times before reaching their final destination. But the framework of long-distance exchange was now anchored at both ends by major civilizations. The political consequences were equally profound. Control over the western regions allowed the Han to project influence beyond their immediate borders, turning them into a power with a genuine transcontinental reach. It also forced them into a new kind of frontier diplomacy, one that involved negotiating with a range of actors, oasis city-states, nomadic confederations, and distant monarchies. The skills and institutions developed in this context, such as the maintenance of garrisons far from the capital, the provision of secure way stations, and the use of tribute and trade to manage alliances, would become permanent features of Chinese imperial policy. Zhang Qian's legacy was celebrated in Chinese history not only because of his perseverance, but because his journeys symbolized a new openness to the wider world. Later historians would credit him with opening the way to the western regions, a phrase that became shorthand for the beginning of what we now call the Silk Road. His story was a reminder that even failed missions could have transformative consequences when they expanded knowledge and created new possibilities. By the early 1st century before the Common Era, the Han presence in the western regions had become firmly established, though it would be challenged in later decades by renewed Xiongnu pressure and by the sheer logistical difficulty of maintaining distant garrisons. Nevertheless, the pathways carved out in this period became the backbone of East-West exchange for centuries to come. By the time the Han Dynasty had established regular contact with Central Asia, the western half of the Silk Road's vast network was dominated by another great power, the Parthian Empire. Stretching from the Iranian plateau to the fringes of Mesopotamia, and at times holding sway deep into Central Asia, the Parthians occupied a geographical position that made them the unavoidable brokers between East and West. To their west lay the Mediterranean world, where the Roman Republic, and later the Roman Empire, was rising to dominance. Between these two poles of power, goods, ideas, and people flowed, but rarely in a direct, unbroken line. Instead, the Parthians and their allies in key caravan cities acted as middlemen, managing both the opportunities and the dangers of long-distance trade. The Parthian state, founded by the Abbasid dynasty in the mid-3rd century before the Common Era, had grown from its origins in northeastern Iran to become a formidable empire by the 1st century before the Common Era. Unlike the centralized bureaucracies of the Han or the earlier Achaemenid Persians, the Parthians ruled through a loose federation of semi-independent kingdoms and noble families. This structure suited the demands of governing a realm crisscrossed by caravan routes and inhabited by diverse peoples, from Iranian farmers to nomadic tribes and Hellenistic urban communities. The Abbasid kings maintained control by balancing these interests and by holding the key strategic points through which goods and travelers had to pass. For merchants traveling between the eastern oases and the ports of the eastern Mediterranean, the Parthian lands were both a barrier and a bridge. The empire's location meant that no caravan could easily bypass it, yet it also meant that the Parthians could tax goods in transit, offer protection to favored traders, and even manipulate the flow of certain commodities to their advantage. Historical sources from the Roman world often portray the Parthians as secretive about the sources of their luxury goods, preferring to keep the Romans ignorant of the true origins of silk, spices, and precious stones. Whether or not this was entirely deliberate, the effect was clear. The Parthians ensured that they remained essential intermediaries in a trade system that stretched far beyond their own frontiers. One of the most valuable commodities moving westward through Parthian territory was silk. Although silk weaving existed in several regions, the finest and most prized silk of this era came from China. By the 1st century of the Common Era, it was in high demand among the Roman elite. Roman authors such as Seneca and Pliny the Elder commented on the extravagance of silk clothing, with Pliny lamenting that Roman gold was flowing east in exchange for garments that were both costly and, in his moral judgment, indecently transparent. Despite such criticism, the appetite for silk only grew. Roman merchants rarely traveled the entire distance to the source of this silk. Instead, caravans carried it westward through Central Asia and Iran, where Parthian traders or their agents would take possession and move it toward markets in Syria and Anatolia. From there, it could be shipped across the Mediterranean to Rome. The reverse flow brought Roman glassware, silver, and fine wines eastward. Some of these goods reached as far as Central Asia, and occasionally even China through the same network of intermediaries. In addition to the Parthians, key urban centers acted as nodes in this trade. One of the most remarkable of these was Palmyra, an oasis city in the Syrian desert. Located between the Euphrates River and the Mediterranean coast, Palmyra was ideally placed to serve as a staging point for caravans arriving from Mesopotamia. Its merchants were skilled in negotiating with both Parthian and Roman authorities, and the city's semi-independent status allowed it to thrive as a neutral ground for commerce. Palmyrene inscriptions and records show a community deeply involved in long-distance trade. Merchant families organized caravans that traveled as far as the Persian Gulf and perhaps beyond, bringing back goods to be redistributed into Roman markets. Palmyra's wealth was displayed in grand colonnaded streets, ornate temples, and elaborate tombs carved with reliefs depicting the faces of its leading citizens. These monuments reflected a culture that blended Greco-Roman artistic influences with local Semitic traditions, itself a product of the city's role as a meeting point for peoples from across the known world. The interaction between Parthia and Rome was not limited to commerce. The two empires were often rivals, clashing over control of Armenia and other border regions. Famous battles, such as the Parthian victory at Karhi in 53 before the Common Era, demonstrated the effectiveness of Parthian cavalry and the strategic importance of controlling the frontier. Yet even during periods of open hostility, trade did not cease entirely. Merchants found ways to navigate shifting political landscapes, sometimes rerouting caravans or using neutral intermediaries. The Parthians also maintained connections to the east beyond the Han's immediate sphere. Through Central Asian states, they had access to goods from India, including spices, aromatics, and semi-precious stones. Maritime routes through the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea complemented the overland trade, bringing in ivory, pearls, and other luxury items. The integration of sea and land routes meant that the Parthian Empire was not just a bridge between east and west, but also a hub in its own right, directing goods in multiple directions. This position of control brought wealth, but it also required constant diplomatic and military balancing. The Parthians had to manage relations with nomadic groups to their northeast, Hellenistic cities in their west, and powerful kingdoms in their south along the Gulf. The decentralized nature of their empire allowed local rulers some autonomy in handling these relationships, but it also meant that the Arsacid kings had to work continually to maintain cohesion among their nobles. For the Romans, the lure of Eastern luxuries was both an economic and a cultural phenomenon. The poet Martial could joke about the extravagance of Roman women draped in fabrics that had traveled from the land where the sun rises, while moralists worried about the drain of precious metals from the empire. Silk became a marker of status, signaling wealth, refinement, and cosmopolitan taste. Over time, the flow of silk and other goods contributed to Rome's engagement with regions far beyond its borders, creating a consumer culture that linked the Mediterranean to the distant civilizations of Asia. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, the basic pattern of east-west trade through Parthian lands was firmly established. While wars and political changes could disrupt particular routes, the overall system proved resilient. The combination of powerful states at either end, willing intermediaries in the middle, and thriving urban centers like Palmyra ensured that goods, ideas, and technologies continued to move across the continent. Yet this arrangement was not permanent. In the 3rd century, the Parthian Empire would be replaced by the Sasanian dynasty, which would bring new energy and new tensions to the control of Eurasian trade. Before that transformation, however, another power was rising in Central Asia, one that would add a different dimension to the Silk Road, the Kushan Empire. With its roots in the migration of the Yuezhi and its position spanning both Indian and Central Asian worlds, the Kushan state would harness trade not only for profit, but also for the spread of religion and culture. By the opening of the 1st century of the Common Era, the political landscape of Central Asia was changing once again. The Parthian Empire still controlled the Iranian plateau, Rome held sway over the eastern Mediterranean, and the Han dynasty maintained influence in parts of the Tarim Basin. Between these great powers, in the fertile valleys and mountain passes linking Central Asia to India, a new empire emerged, the Kushan Empire. This state would become a crucial link in the Silk Road system, not only because of the goods it moved, but because of the religious and cultural networks it nurtured, especially those connected to Buddhism. The origins of the Kushans lay in the migrations of the Yuezhi people, who had once lived in the Gansu region of northwestern China. Pressed westward by the Xiongnu during the 2nd century before the Common Era, the Yuezhi eventually settled in Bactria, displacing the remnants of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Over time, one branch of the Yuezhi consolidated power over the others, and by the 1st century of the Common Era, their leaders had established themselves as the rulers of a large and multi-ethnic realm stretching from the Oxus River to the plains of northern India. The most famous of these rulers was Kanishka, remembered both in inscriptions and in Buddhist tradition as a powerful patron of religion and culture. Under Kanishka and his successors, the Kushan Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, controlling key sections of the overland routes through Bactria, Gandhara, and the passes of the Hindu Kush. This position allowed them to act as intermediaries not only between East and West, but also between the northern steppe world and the Indian subcontinent. Economically, the Kushans benefited from their control over rich agricultural lands and from the tolls and taxes levied on caravans passing through their territory. Goods from the Mediterranean and the Iranian plateau moved through Kushan lands on their way to China, while silk, lacquerware, and other Eastern products traveled westward through the same corridors. At the same time, the Kushans maintained strong connections to the maritime routes of the Indian Ocean via ports in present-day Pakistan and western India. From these ports, spices, ivory, and precious stones could be shipped to the Roman world, while Mediterranean glassware and wine entered South Asia. What set the Kushans apart, however, was not only their position in the trade network, but their role in promoting the movement of ideas, particularly Buddhism. The religion had arisen in the Gangetic plains of India several centuries earlier, but it was during the Kushan period that it spread widely into Central Asia and beyond. This expansion was aided by the fact that Buddhist monastic communities often established themselves along major trade routes. Monasteries provided lodging, food, and security for travelers, whether they were pilgrims, merchants, or envoys. In return, these communities received donations from wealthy patrons, including Kushan rulers, and from passing traders who valued their services. In the region of Gandhara, the fusion of Hellenistic artistic traditions with Buddhist themes produced a distinctive visual style that would have a lasting influence on Buddhist art across Asia. Sculptures of the Buddha from this period depict him with realistic facial features, flowing robes reminiscent of Greek togas, and sometimes with a halo, a feature that would spread into later Buddhist iconography. These artistic innovations traveled with the religion itself, carried by monks and artisans into Central Asia, China, and eventually Korea and Japan. The Kushan Empire also played a role in the standardization and transmission of Buddhist texts. The adoption of Gandhari, written in the Kharosthi script, and later Sanskrit as languages for Buddhist scripture, allowed teachings to be recorded and shared more widely. Missionary monks from the Kushan realm journeyed to the Tarim Basin, where they established communities in oases like Khotan and Kucha. These centers became important waypoints for the transmission of both Mahayana and earlier Buddhist traditions into China. From a political perspective, the Kushans understood the value of presenting themselves as universal rulers capable of uniting diverse peoples. Their coinage reflected this ambition, depicting not only the kings themselves, but also a pantheon of deities drawn from Greek, Iranian, Indian, and even Mesopotamian traditions. This inclusive imagery signaled to their subjects and trading partners that the Kushan realm was a place where multiple cultures could meet and flourish. In this way, the empire's ideology supported its economic and cultural role as a mediator in the Silk Road network. The diplomatic reach of the Kushans extended in multiple directions. They maintained contact with the Han court, as recorded in Chinese histories that describe the exchange of envoys and gifts. Relations with the Parthians were more complex, involving both competition for control of certain trade routes and cooperation in facilitating the movement of goods. In the south, the Kushans interacted with Indian kingdoms and the emerging Satavahana dynasty, which controlled parts of the Deccan and important ports on the eastern and western coasts. The stability of the Kushan realm during its height allowed for sustained flows of commerce and culture. Caravans moved relatively securely through its territories, and the network of monasteries, caravanserais, and markets formed an infrastructure that encouraged long-distance trade. The fact that Buddhism, a religion with strong ethical and communal values, was linked to this infrastructure may have increased trust among traders of different backgrounds, helping to reduce the risks inherent in cross-cultural exchange. Over time, however, the Kushan Empire faced pressures that would erode its power. In the 3rd century of the Common Era, the rise of the Sasanian Empire in Iran brought a formidable new rival to its western frontiers. At the same time, internal divisions and the difficulty of governing such a diverse and geographically expansive realm began to weaken central authority. In the north, nomadic groups continued to move across the steppes, sometimes disrupting trade routes and challenging Kushan control in Central Asia. Despite its decline, the cultural and religious legacy of the Kushans endured. The Buddhist communities they had supported remained active in Central Asia for centuries, continuing to serve as nodes of the Silk Road long after the political structure that had nurtured them had vanished. Artistic styles developed in Gandhara influenced Buddhist imagery across Asia, and the memory of Kushan kings like Kanishka lived on in Buddhist historical narratives. The Kushan period demonstrated that the Silk Road was never solely about the movement of goods. Ideas, artistic traditions, and religious beliefs could be just as important as silk, spices, or precious metals in shaping the history of Eurasia. In the case of the Kushans, their political and economic strategies were deeply intertwined with their role as patrons of a transcontinental religious network, one that would continue to shape the cultural landscape of Asia for many generations. By the 4th century of the Common Era, the political map of Eurasia had shifted yet again. The Han Dynasty had long since fallen, the Kushan Empire was fragmenting, and the Parthians had been replaced by the Sasanians in Iran. Yet through all these upheavals, the Silk Road remained active, sustained now less by the might of a single empire and more by the skill of professional trading communities. Among these, none were more influential than the Sogdians. The Sogdians were an Iranian-speaking people whose homeland lay in the fertile river valleys between the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, in the region of Samarkand, Bukhara, and other oases of present-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. This location placed them at a crossroads. To the east lay the Tarim Basin and China, to the west the Iranian Plateau, and to the south the passes into Bactria and India. By the 4th century, Sogdian merchants had transformed this advantageous geography into a network that stretched across much of Eurasia. Unlike the Kushans, who had ruled an empire, or the Parthians, who controlled a centralized territory, the Sogdians operated as a commercial commonwealth, a loose but resilient system of city-states bound together by shared language, culture, and mercantile expertise. Each Sogdian city was governed independently, yet they maintained strong ties through kinship, marriage alliances, and common religious practices. Zoroastrianism remained the dominant faith, though Sogdians were often remarkably tolerant, interacting comfortably with Buddhists, Christians, and later Manichaeans. The strength of the Sogdian trading system lay in its ability to function across political boundaries. Individual merchants often established long-term residences in distant cities, forming diasporas that acted as permanent outposts of the homeland. Archaeological discoveries in China, Mongolia, and even along the Volga River have revealed inscriptions, contracts, and letters written in Sogdian script, evidence of the far reach of their activities. These communities could act as brokers between local producers and the vast markets of Eurasia, translating not only languages but also cultural expectations and commercial practices. One of the most remarkable finds illustrating the Sogdian world is the collection known as the Ancient Letters, discovered near Dunhuang in western China and dated to the early 4th century. These personal correspondences between Sogdian merchants and their families in Samarkand reveal both the scale of their trade and the hazards they faced. In one letter, a merchant laments the destruction of the Chinese capital Luoyang during political upheavals, which had ruined his business and left him destitute. Such documents bring a human voice to the history of the Silk Road, showing how individual lives were bound up with the fortunes of distant markets and unstable politics. Sogdian commerce was diverse. They traded Chinese silks and paper, Central Asian horses, Roman and Byzantine glassware, Indian spices, and Sasanian silverware. They also dealt in more ordinary but equally essential goods, such as salt, grain, and leather. Their caravans might carry luxury items for wealthy patrons alongside everyday necessities for frontier garrisons and remote towns. The adaptability of the Sogdians was a key to their success. They could shift routes when wars broke out, change partners when regimes fell, and find new commodities when demand shifted. The organization of Sogdian trade was often based on family firms. Relatives could be stationed in different cities along the route, each managing a segment of the operation. Trust was reinforced by kinship, and profits were shared across the family network. This system allowed Sogdian merchants to extend credit over long distances, confident that their partners would honor agreements even without the enforcement of a single state authority. Such arrangements were vital in a world where caravans could take months to complete a journey and where political borders could change before a deal was finalized. Culturally, the Sogdians were cosmopolitans. They absorbed artistic influences from the many lands they visited, and their art, in turn, traveled with them. Murals from Panjikent, a Sogdian city in modern Tajikistan, depict scenes of banquets, epic tales, and foreign envoys, blending Iranian, Indian, and Chinese elements. These images suggest a society that took pride in its connections to the wider world and in its ability to mediate between different cultural spheres. Religion played a role in Sogdian trade not only through shared belief systems but also through practical infrastructure. Zoroastrian fire temples served as community centers for diaspora merchants, while Buddhist monasteries along certain routes provided safe lodging. Manichaean communities, with their own extensive networks, sometimes overlapped with Sogdian trade, especially in the later period. The willingness of Sogdians to engage with multiple religious traditions made them welcome guests in many regions, and their multi-faith adaptability helped reduce barriers to trade. Politically, the Sogdians had to navigate a complex landscape. In the west, they dealt with the powerful Sasanian Empire, which sometimes imposed restrictions on independent trade, but also offered lucrative markets for goods. In the east, they interacted with the Northern Wei and later dynasties in China, sometimes serving as official envoys or interpreters. To the north, they traded with Turkic and other nomadic peoples of the steppe, exchanging textiles and manufactured goods for horses, furs, and livestock products. The arrival of the first Turkic Khaganate in the 6th century brought both challenges and opportunities. The Turkic rulers recognized the value of Sogdian expertise and often employed them as diplomats and administrators. In some cases, Sogdian merchants even helped negotiate alliances between the Turks and the Chinese courts. This ability to serve multiple masters without losing their own identity was a hallmark of Sogdian resilience. One consequence of Sogdian activity was the deepening of cultural links between China and the Iranian world. Chinese texts from the Tang period, centuries later, would remember the Sogdians as the quintessential foreign merchants, often depicting them in art and literature as shrewd traders with distinctive clothing and musical instruments. Sogdian music and dance became popular in Chinese urban centers, a reminder that cultural exchange often followed the same routes as commercial exchange. The dominance of the Sogdians in overland trade reached its peak in the 6th and early 7th centuries, just before the rise of the Tang Dynasty in China and the expansion of Arab power in the Middle East. In these centuries, the Sogdian network could function almost like a single organism, reacting quickly to changes and maintaining a steady flow of goods even when empires faltered. Their legacy would be felt long after political shifts diminished their prominence, as many of the practices they developed, such as diaspora trading communities, multilingual record-keeping, and credit networks, would be adopted by later merchant groups. By the end of the 6th century, however, the world in which the Sogdians had thrived was beginning to change. The unification of China under the Sui and then the Tang promised a new era of state-backed security in the east, while in the west, the Byzantine-Sasanian conflicts and the impending expansion of Islam would reshape the map of trade. The Sogdians would continue to play a vital role under these new conditions, but their story would increasingly intertwine with the fortunes of powerful empires. By the early 7th century of the Common Era, China had emerged from centuries of political fragmentation. The Tang Dynasty, founded in the year 618, quickly consolidated power over a vast and diverse empire. Under the Tang, China entered a period of relative stability, economic expansion, and cultural openness unmatched in most of its previous history. This political and administrative stability, combined with military successes on the frontiers, transformed the eastern segment of the Silk Road into one of the safest and most vibrant corridors in the world. At the heart of this network stood the Tang capital, Chang'an, a city whose markets became a symbol of the cosmopolitan age. The Tang rulers understood the strategic importance of the overland trade routes that passed through the Tarim Basin and into Central Asia. Early in their reign, they moved to secure control over these corridors, defeating rivals and forming alliances with Turkic powers who held sway over the steppe. The decisive victory at the Battle of Irtish River in the early 7th century, along with successful campaigns against the Western Turks, gave the Tang a strong position in the oases of the Tarim Basin. These oases, such as Kucha, Kashgar, and Khotan, were essential waypoints for caravans, providing water, shelter, and markets in the otherwise inhospitable desert environment. To administer these distant territories, the Tang established the Angxi Protectorate, headquartered first at Gaochang and later at Kucha. This system placed Chinese military governors in charge of garrisons and local affairs, while allowing a degree of autonomy for the oasis kingdoms in return for tribute and cooperation. The presence of Tang troops and officials brought a measure of security to the routes that merchants had long traversed, encouraging more frequent and larger caravans to make the journey between China and the western regions. The Tang also cultivated alliances with powerful nomadic groups. The early dynasty's close ties with the Eastern Turkic Khaganate ensured that the steppe routes leading into Central Asia were relatively safe for Tang merchants and envoys. These political relationships were often cemented by marriages between Tang princesses and Turkic rulers, as well as by the exchange of lavish gifts. Such diplomacy recognized that control over the Silk Road required not only military force, but also the cooperation of mobile powers who could protect or disrupt the flow of trade. The result of this stability was a dramatic increase in the volume and diversity of goods entering and leaving Tang China. From the west came fine glassware from the Byzantine Empire, silver vessels from the Sasanian and later Islamic worlds, fragrant spices from India and Southeast Asia, and horses from the Fergana Valley. From the east flowed silk, porcelain, lacquerware, paper, and tea. Tang artisans adapted foreign techniques into their own crafts, producing, for example, high-fired ceramics with glazes inspired by imports from the Middle East. Chang'an itself became the ultimate destination for many of these goods. As the imperial capital, it was the largest and most cosmopolitan city in East Asia, with a population that may have approached 1 million at its peak. The city's layout was a masterpiece of urban planning with wide boulevards, orderly markets, and designated quarters for foreign residents. The Western market was especially renowned for its role in international trade, with stalls offering wares from every corner of the known world. Sogdian traders could be found here alongside Arab, Persian, Indian, Korean, and Japanese merchants. Foreign communities in Chang'an maintained their own religious institutions, adding to the city's cultural diversity. Zoroastrian fire temples, Buddhist monasteries, Nestorian Christian churches, and even early Islamic mosques stood within the city's walls. These places of worship served not only spiritual needs, but also acted as centers for their respective communities, where merchants could find familiar customs, languages, and contacts. The Tang court generally tolerated these diverse traditions, seeing them as part of the empire's prestige as a global hub. The cultural exchange was not limited to goods and religion. Music, dance, and fashion from Central Asia and beyond became highly fashionable at the Tang court. Instruments such as the pipa, derived from the Persian barbat, and dances from the western regions were incorporated into court entertainment. Aristocratic women were known to wear high boots and riding jackets in Central Asian style, while foreign grooms and performers became common in elite households. This openness to foreign culture was a hallmark of the Tang Golden Age, though it also sparked occasional debates among scholars and officials about preserving traditional Chinese customs. The economic benefits of the Silk Road trade under the Tang were substantial. Taxes and duties collected at border markets filled the imperial treasury, while the availability of foreign luxuries reinforced the prestige of the Tang elite. The state also used the trade routes to supply strategic needs, such as importing high-quality horses for the imperial cavalry. The government maintained official trading posts along the frontier, where foreign merchants could exchange goods under controlled conditions, ensuring both revenue and security. Importantly, the Tang's control of the Silk Road was not limited to land routes. Maritime trade expanded significantly during this period, with the port of Guangzhou becoming a major hub for ships arriving from Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East. While the maritime routes will be discussed in more detail later, their growth under the Tang complemented the overland trade, allowing goods to move between sea and land more efficiently. Chang'an, though far inland, was connected to these maritime routes by river and canal systems, ensuring that the capital benefited from both streams of commerce. The Tang period also saw advancements in infrastructure that supported long-distance trade. Roads were repaired and extended, postal relay stations maintained, and inns and warehouses established along key routes. The relay system, similar in concept to the Achaemenid royal road centuries earlier, allowed official envoys and urgent goods to travel quickly. These logistical improvements made the Silk Road under the Tang more reliable than in many previous eras. However, the Tang Golden Age was not without challenges. The vast distances involved meant that local rebellions, steppe raids, or rival powers in Central Asia could still disrupt trade. The rise of the Tibetan Empire in the 7th century brought a formidable new competitor for influence in the Tarim Basin. At times, the Tang and Tibetans fought directly for control of strategic oases, and the balance of power in the region could shift rapidly. Still, for much of the 7th and early 8th centuries, the Tang maintained enough authority to keep the Silk Road's eastern half thriving. By the height of Tang prosperity, the Silk Road was more than just a set of trade routes. It was a conduit for a shared cosmopolitan culture that spanned continents. Chang'an stood at the center of this world, its markets stocked with goods from thousands of kilometers away, its streets alive with languages and customs from dozens of peoples. The city embodied the promise of the Silk Road, that distant lands, despite their differences, could be connected through commerce, diplomacy, and mutual curiosity. Yet this period of stability would not last indefinitely. The mid-8th century would bring political upheaval, foreign invasions, and internal rebellion that would weaken the Tang's hold on Central Asia. The decisive moment would come in a confrontation far from the Chinese heartland, on a riverbank in Central Asia, where Tang forces would meet an army from the Islamic world. The mid-8th century of the Common Era marked a turning point in the history of the Silk Road. For more than a century, the Tang dynasty had enjoyed relative dominance over the eastern and central corridors of the overland routes. Its control of the Tarim Basin, along with strong alliances and military presence in Central Asia, had ensured a stable and profitable environment for trade. Yet this carefully maintained order began to unravel due to a convergence of events: military confrontation with the Islamic Abbasid Caliphate, growing Tibetan power, and a devastating rebellion at home. The most symbolic and strategically significant of these events was the Battle of Talas in the year 751. The Tang had long sought to extend their influence deeper into Central Asia, where they competed not only with local powers but increasingly with the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. The Abbasids, who had replaced the Umayyads in the year 750, inherited a network of territories stretching from North Africa to the borders of Central Asia. Control of the rich trade routes across Transoxiana was as valuable to them as it was to the Tang. Tensions came to a head in the fertile Fergana Valley and along the Sir-Darya River, where local rulers, caught between the two great powers, sometimes invited one side's intervention against the other. The Tang sought to solidify their position by supporting a local ally in the city of Tashkent, while the Abbasids, working with their Turkic Karluk allies, moved to counter Tang influence. The confrontation culminated on the banks of the Talas River, where Tang forces under General Gao Xianji faced an army of Abbasid troops and Karluk warriors. Initially, the Tang troops, well-trained and disciplined, held their ground. However, during the battle, the Karluks switched sides, attacking the Tang from the rear. This betrayal shattered the Tang lines and forced Gao Xianji to order a retreat. The defeat at Talas was significant not because it resulted in vast territorial losses. The Tang withdrew primarily from the westernmost parts of Central Asia, but because it signaled the end of Chinese ambitions to dominate the entire region. From that point onward, the political landscape of Central Asia would be defined by a balance between Islamic powers in the west and a more limited Chinese presence in the east. The consequences of Talas extended beyond military strategy. In later historical narratives, the battle became famous for another reason: the transfer of paper-making technology from Chinese artisans captured by the Abbasids. Whether this account is entirely accurate or a later embellishment, it reflects the larger truth that technological and cultural knowledge often traveled alongside, and sometimes as a result of, military conflict. The spread of paper-making westward would have profound effects on the Islamic world and, eventually, on Europe. While the defeat at Talas curtailed Tang influence in the far west, another challenge was rising much closer to home. The Tibetan Empire, which had been expanding aggressively since the 7th century, began to press into territories the Tang considered vital. At their height, the Tibetans controlled a vast highland domain that included not only the Tibetan Plateau, but also parts of what is now Western China, Nepal, Bhutan, and large swathes of Central Asia. The Tibetans had already clashed with the Tang over control of the Silk Road oases in the Tarim Basin. These oases, such as Khotan and Kashgar, were not only sources of tribute but also critical waypoints for caravans. The Tang-Tibetan struggle saw territories change hands multiple times, with both sides relying on shifting alliances with local rulers and nomadic confederations. The Tibetans proved adept at exploiting Tang weaknesses, especially after Talas, when Chinese military resources were stretched thin. Then, in the year 755, a catastrophe struck within the Tang heartland, the Anlushan Rebellion. Anlushan, a powerful frontier general of mixed Sogdian and Turkic heritage, turned against the Tang court and declared himself emperor of a rival state. His rebellion plunged the empire into years of civil war, causing immense destruction and loss of life. The Tang were forced to recall troops from the frontier to defend the capital and suppress the uprising. During these years of internal chaos, the Tibetans advanced further into Central Asia and even occupied the Tang capital of Chang'an for a brief period in the year 763. This humiliation underscored the vulnerability of the dynasty, which was now far less able to project power beyond its immediate borders. In the Tarim Basin, Tang garrisons were abandoned or overrun, and many of the oasis kingdoms shifted allegiance to Tibetan or other regional powers. The weakening of Tang authority on the frontier had direct effects on the Silk Road. Without the security provided by Tang armies and administrators, caravan routes became more dangerous. Merchants had to rely increasingly on local rulers or nomadic protectors, paying higher tolls and facing greater risks of robbery or extortion. Trade did not cease. Demand for goods like silk, horses, and spices remained high, but the network became more fragmented, with regional powers controlling different stretches of the route. In the west, the Abbasid Caliphate consolidated its hold over Transoxiana and began to integrate it into the broader Islamic world. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, which had long histories as trading centers, now flourished under Muslim rule, becoming hubs not only of commerce, but also of scholarship, art, and religious learning. Arabic became a language of trade alongside Persian and Sogdian, and Islamic legal and financial institutions began to influence commercial practices along the Western Silk Road. Meanwhile, the Karluks, who had played a decisive role at Talas, expanded their power in the steppes and the Tian Shan Mountains, creating another layer of political complexity in the region. Their control of certain mountain passes allowed them to influence the flow of goods between Central Asia and the Tarim Basin, sometimes in cooperation with the Tibetans, at other times in opposition. By the close of the 8th century, the Silk Road had entered a new phase. The days of unchallenged Tang dominance were over, replaced by a patchwork of competing powers: the Abbasids in the west, the Tibetans in the south and center, various Turkic confederations in the steppes, and the diminished Tang authority in the east. This fragmentation did not end the Silk Road's vitality, but it changed its character. Instead of a single overarching power ensuring stability, merchants had to navigate a series of overlapping jurisdictions, each with its own demands and dangers. Despite these challenges, the period following Talas was also one of rich cultural interaction. The coexistence of multiple powers encouraged the mixing of artistic styles, religious ideas, and commercial techniques. In some regions, the absence of tight imperial control allowed for greater autonomy among local communities, including merchant diasporas like the Sogdians, who continued to adapt and thrive. The Tang dynasty would survive the An-Lushan rebellion and even regain some measure of stability in the 9th century, but it would never again dominate Central Asia as it had in the century before Talas. The Silk Road endured, but it was now shaped by a balance of powers rather than the dominance of a single empire. This new reality would set the stage for the next great transformation of the overland routes, as the Islamic world reached its height and became a central driver of trade, finance, and cultural exchange across Eurasia. By the mid-8th century of the Common Era, the center of gravity in the western half of Eurasia had shifted decisively. The Abbasid Caliphate, having overthrown the Umayyad dynasty in the year 750, established its capital at Baghdad, a newly built city on the banks of the Tigris River. From this position, the Abbasids presided over a realm that stretched from the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the borders of Central Asia. Baghdad quickly became not only the political heart of this vast empire, but also the most dynamic commercial hub of its age, drawing goods, people, and ideas from every corner of the known world. The Abbasid rise to power coincided with the decline of Tang control in Central Asia after the Battle of Talas. This geopolitical change allowed the Islamic world to extend its influence eastward, integrating the caravan cities of Transoxiana and beyond into a broader network of Islamic governance and culture. Cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv became important way stations for goods traveling between China and the Middle East, while also serving as centers of scholarship and administration under Muslim rulers. Baghdad's location was ideal for coordinating both overland and maritime trade. To the north and east, roads and river routes linked the city to the Iranian plateau, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. To the south, the Tigris connected with Basra and the Persian Gulf, opening onto the Indian Ocean and the Maritime Silk Road. This allowed the Abbasids to manage and benefit from multiple commercial corridors simultaneously. Goods could arrive from China by caravan, be transferred onto ships in the Gulf, and continue to East Africa or India, or take the reverse journey with spices from the Malabar coast, reaching Central Asia overland. The range of goods flowing into Baghdad was astonishing. From the east came silks, porcelain, lacquerware, and paper from China, spices, aromatics, and gems from India and Southeast Asia, and high-quality horses from Central Asia. From the Mediterranean and Europe came glassware, fine textiles, and precious metals. Africa contributed ivory, gold, and exotic animal products. Baghdad's markets were a living display of the interconnectedness of the Islamic world's trading sphere. The Abbasids were not merely passive recipients of these goods. They developed sophisticated financial systems to facilitate long-distance trade. Merchants could use letters of credit, known as suftaja, to avoid carrying large quantities of cash across dangerous terrain. Wealthy merchant houses operated across multiple cities, enabling them to extend loans, ensure shipments, and manage complex ventures involving partners from different regions. These innovations reduced the risks of long-distance commerce and increased its profitability, encouraging more merchants to participate in the trade. Arabic became a lingua franca of commerce across much of the Silk Road during this era, complementing Persian, which also flourished as a literary and administrative language. In the Eastern Islamic world, Sogdian still held local importance in some regions, but over time, Arabic and Persian replaced it in many formal contexts. This linguistic integration made it easier for merchants from far-flung parts of the empire to conduct business with one another. Cultural exchange under the Abbasids was as vibrant as the economic one. Baghdad became a center for the translation and preservation of knowledge from earlier civilizations. At the famed House of Wisdom, scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian works into Arabic, covering subjects as diverse as mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. These texts often traveled along the same routes as commercial goods carried by scholars, diplomats, or wealthy patrons. In this way, the intellectual heritage of multiple civilizations was gathered, studied, and transmitted to new audiences across Eurasia. One important example of technological transfer during this period was the spread of papermaking. Whether the story of its introduction after Talas is accurate or not, it is clear that by the early 9th century, paper mills were operating in Baghdad and other Islamic cities. Paper rapidly replaced parchment and papyrus as the preferred medium for books and documents, making written communication cheaper and more widely available. This in turn boosted record-keeping, legal documentation, and the production of literature, all of which supported the expansion of trade. The Abbasid integration of overland and maritime trade was particularly effective in creating redundancy in the network. If political instability or conflict disrupted one route, goods could often be rerouted along another. For example, if caravan routes through the Iranian plateau were threatened, merchants could ship goods from the Indian Ocean up the Persian Gulf to Basra, then transport them by river and road to Baghdad. Similarly, if maritime routes were endangered by piracy or storms, goods could be sent overland through Central Asia. The Caliphate's control over a vast, relatively unified political space allowed for a high degree of security and predictability in trade. While local conflicts and banditry remained threats, the overall environment was far more stable than in periods of fragmented rule. The Abbasids maintained garrisons along major routes and encouraged the construction of caravanserais, where merchants could rest and resupply. These facilities not only supported commerce, but also facilitated the exchange of news, political information, and cultural trends. Religious institutions also played a role in supporting trade under the Abbasids. Islamic law provided clear guidelines for commercial transactions, partnerships, and dispute resolution, giving merchants a shared legal framework across the empire. Charitable endowments, or waqf, sometimes funded infrastructure like roads, wells, and caravanserais, indirectly aiding commerce. Pilgrimage routes to Mecca intersected with trade routes, allowing merchants to combine religious and commercial travel. The Abbasid capital's cosmopolitan atmosphere rivaled that of Tang. Travelers from Central Asia, India, China, Africa, and Europe mingled in its streets. Markets were organized into specialized quarters, each dedicated to a particular type of good: spices in one, textiles in another, metals and weapons in a third. Skilled artisans produced luxury goods for local consumption and for export, blending techniques from different traditions. For example, Abbasid pottery often incorporated Chinese-inspired glazes alongside Middle Eastern decorative motifs. The influence of Baghdad extended far beyond its immediate surroundings. Its demand for luxury goods stimulated production in distant regions, from silk workshops in China to glassmakers in Syria. Its financial institutions set standards that would be adopted by merchant communities from the Maghreb to India. Its scholars preserved and expanded bodies of knowledge that would later reach Europe, shaping the course of the medieval world. However, the very wealth and complexity of the Abbasid commercial system also made it vulnerable to political shifts. As the 9th century progressed, internal divisions, provincial rebellions, and the rise of semi-independent dynasties weakened central authority. While Baghdad remained an important center, the balance of power began to shift toward regional capitals such as Samarkand, Nishapur, and Cairo. This decentralization did not end trade. Indeed, in some cases it encouraged competition and innovation, but it marked the beginning of a more fragmented political landscape within the Islamic world. Despite these changes, the legacy of the Abbasid period was enduring. The integration of overland and maritime silk roads under a single cultural and economic sphere created a model of connectivity that would influence later powers, including the Mongols centuries later. The Abbasids had shown that control over trade routes was not only about military dominance, but also about fostering an environment of trust, legal certainty, and shared cultural norms. While caravans trudged across deserts and mountain passes, another set of routes, wider, faster, and capable of carrying far greater volumes of goods, was flourishing across the seas. The Maritime Silk Road connected ports from the eastern Mediterranean to the South China Sea, harnessing the predictable rhythms of the monsoon winds to knit together markets separated by thousands of kilometers of open water. By the 7th century of the Common Era, these sea lanes had become an indispensable counterpart to the overland Silk Road, and over the next several centuries, they would sometimes surpass the land routes in economic and political importance. The key to the Maritime Silk Road's efficiency lay in the monsoon system of the Indian Ocean. Seasonal wind patterns shifted direction reliably each year, blowing from the southwest during the summer months and from the northeast during the winter. Mariners who understood this cycle could plan voyages with remarkable precision, timing their departures so that they could travel quickly in one direction, wait for the seasonal reversal, and then return. Arab, Persian, Indian, Malay, and later Chinese sailors all mastered these patterns, making it possible to link distant ports in regular commercial circuits. From the Islamic ports of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, ships carried textiles, glassware, metalwork, and horses to the Indian subcontinent, returning with spices, gems, and cotton cloth. Indian merchants traded with Southeast Asian ports for aromatic woods, gold, and tin, while also sending ships farther east to southern China. Southeast Asian polities, such as Srivijaya, based in Sumatra, became vital intermediaries, controlling the narrow straits of Malacca, through which so much maritime trade passed. By taxing passing ships and offering safe anchorages, Srivijaya grew wealthy and powerful, attracting pilgrims, scholars, and artisans, as well as merchants. China's role in the Maritime Silk Road expanded significantly under the Tang Dynasty, though its full maritime dominance would come later. Southern Chinese ports, such as Guangzhou, became bustling centers for international trade, receiving ships from as far away as the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa. These foreign merchants often lived in their own quarters within the city, where they could maintain their customs and languages while doing business under Tang oversight. The Tang court recognized the value of this trade, and officials collected customs duties on imported goods, adding a steady stream of revenue to the state treasury. The Song dynasty, beginning in the late 10th century, pushed Chinese maritime involvement to new heights. Political pressures in the north, where steppe empires like the Khitan Liao and the Jurchen Jin blocked or restricted overland routes, encouraged the Song to turn to the sea. Shipbuilding technology advanced rapidly. Large ocean-going junks with multiple masts and watertight bulkheads could carry hundreds of tons of cargo. The magnetic compass, used by Chinese navigators by the 11th century, allowed for more accurate open-sea voyages, reducing dependence on coastal landmarks. These technological improvements allowed Song merchants to participate directly in the Indian Ocean trade rather than relying solely on intermediaries. Chinese ceramics, particularly the highly prized celadons and later blue and white porcelain, were shipped in vast quantities to markets in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa. In return, China imported spices such as cloves and nutmeg from the Maluku Islands, pepper from India, and frankincense and myrrh from Arabia. The scale of maritime commerce grew so large that, by some estimates, the value of goods moving along the sea lanes in certain periods rivaled or exceeded that of the overland Silk Road. The Islamic world remained central to the Maritime Silk Road throughout this era. From the Abbasid heartlands to the Swahili coast of East Africa, Muslim merchants maintained extensive trading networks, often facilitated by shared religious and legal frameworks. The port cities of Aden, Hormuz, and Siraf in the Persian Gulf were thriving centers where goods from East Africa, the Middle East, India, and China could be exchanged. On the African coast, cities like Kilwa and Mogadishu exported gold, ivory, and exotic animal products to the Middle East and Asia, importing ceramics, cloth, and beads in return. The Swahili city-states, though far from the overland Silk Road, were deeply integrated into its maritime counterpart. Archaeological finds of Chinese porcelain and Middle Eastern glass in these cities attest to the reach of these oceanic connections. The wealth generated by trade supported impressive stone architecture, mosques, and elaborate urban life along the East African coast. Maritime routes also played a critical role in the spread of religions, just as the overland Silk Road had done. Islam expanded along the Indian Ocean littoral, carried by traders who built mosques and established Muslim communities in port cities from East Africa to Southeast Asia. Buddhism continued to move eastward and southward by sea, reaching parts of Indonesia, Malaysia, and beyond. Hinduism and various local belief systems also traveled along with the merchants and sailors who practiced them. The result was a rich tapestry of cultural and religious pluralism in the major trading ports. In Southeast Asia, control over strategic choke points like the Straits of Malacca or the Sunda Strait meant control over vast flows of wealth. The Srivijayan Empire leveraged this advantage for centuries, offering safe harbors and acting as a cultural and religious center for Buddhist learning. Later, the Majapahit Empire in Java and other regional powers would play similar roles, ensuring that Southeast Asia remained central to the functioning of the Maritime Silk Road. By the Yuan dynasty in China during the 13th and 14th centuries, maritime trade reached unprecedented levels. The Mongol rulers, who had already revitalized overland connections across Eurasia, encouraged maritime commerce as well. The port of Quanzhou, in present-day Fujian province, became one of the busiest in the world, with foreign merchant communities from Persia, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. Official records describe the arrival of fleets laden with pepper, aromatics, and exotic woods, as well as tribute missions from far-flung lands. One of the most striking features of the Maritime Silk Road was its ability to move bulk goods that would have been impractical to transport overland. While caravans specialized in high-value, low-weight commodities like silk, spices, and precious stones, ships could carry heavy cargo such as ceramics, timber, and large quantities of grain. This allowed for a more diverse and sometimes more profitable range of trade, as bulk goods could supply broader markets rather than just elite consumers. Navigation along the Maritime Silk Road was not without risks. Storms, shipwrecks, and piracy were constant threats. Political instability in port cities or along sea lanes could disrupt the flow of trade just as effectively as wars on the overland routes. However, the existence of multiple interconnected ports and the cyclical nature of the monsoon winds gave the system resilience. If one port became unsafe, merchants could often redirect to another and still complete their trading circuit within the season. By the 14th century, the Maritime Silk Road had become an integrated part of the global economy of the time, linking the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea into a single interconnected system. The monsoon winds continued to turn like clockwork, carrying with them not only goods, but also languages, customs, and technologies that reshaped societies across continents. The collapse of the Tang Dynasty in the early 10th century of the Common Era ushered in a period of political fragmentation in China that would reshape the overland Silk Road. Where a single centralized power had once guarded the eastern arteries of trade, now multiple states competed for territory and influence. This new political map, dominated in the north by steppe empires such as the Khitan Liao and later the Jurchen Jin, and in the south by the Song dynasty, posed challenges for long-distance commerce. Yet it also stimulated innovations and alternative routes that kept the Silk Road alive, even if its character shifted. The Khitan Liao dynasty, founded in the year 907 by a confederation of nomadic tribes from the Mongolian steppe, expanded into northern China and Manchuria, ruling over both nomadic and sedentary populations. The Liao adopted a dual administrative system. Steppe traditions governed their nomadic subjects, while Chinese-style bureaucracies managed the agricultural regions. This flexibility allowed them to control key sections of the Silk Road's eastern branch, particularly those leading from the Mongolian plateau into the Chinese heartland. The Liao were not simply raiders or obstacles to trade. They recognized the value of commerce and established markets along their frontiers where goods from the steppe, Central Asia, and the Song South could be exchanged. Horse trading became a central feature of these border markets, with the Liao supplying high-quality mounts in exchange for silk, tea, and grain from the Song. These exchanges were often regulated by formal agreements, a reminder that even rival states could find mutual benefit in maintaining economic links. In the early 12th century, the Khitan Liao were displaced by the Jurchen, a Tungusic people from the forests of Manchuria, who established the Jin dynasty. The Jurchen were skilled warriors and quickly expanded their control over northern China, forcing the Song to retreat to the south. The resulting political division, often called the Northern and Southern Song period, created a stark geopolitical barrier across China's heartland. For the Southern Song, headquartered in the prosperous city of Hangzhou, the loss of the north meant losing direct control of the main overland routes into Central Asia. This forced them to adapt. One major strategy was to shift emphasis toward maritime trade. The Southern Song invested heavily in shipbuilding and port infrastructure, expanding overseas commerce through ports like Quanzhou and Guangzhou. These maritime routes connected the Southern Song to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and even East Africa, allowing them to bypass the overland routes dominated by the Jin. Still, overland trade was not abandoned entirely. The Song and Jin maintained formal tribute and tea-for-horse trade agreements that allowed limited and regulated exchanges across the border. Under these arrangements, the Song supplied the Jin with tea, silk, and manufactured goods while receiving horses, furs, and medicinal products from the north. These transactions took place in designated border markets under strict supervision, ensuring that commerce could continue even between military rivals. The Jin dynasty, for its part, maintained active relations with the steppe and Central Asia. They traded with the Tangut Kingdom to their west, as well as with various Turkic and Mongol tribes beyond the Great Wall. Like the Liao before them, the Jin recognized the value of controlling key trade corridors and fortified strategic passes to protect and profit from the goods moving through their territory. While the divided political landscape created barriers for merchants, it also spurred diversification in trade routes. Caravans heading to or from Central Asia could skirt Jin territory by taking northern steppe paths through Mongol lands, or they could move southward to connect with maritime ports. This flexibility in routing kept goods flowing, though often at higher costs and greater risks. The need to negotiate multiple jurisdictions meant that merchants increasingly relied on intermediary trading communities, many of them Central Asian Muslims or Sogdian-descended families, who had the connections and diplomatic skills to navigate complex political situations. Internally, the Southern Song economy flourished despite the geopolitical constraints. Advances in agricultural productivity, urbanization, and manufacturing created surpluses that could be exported. The Southern Song became known for their fine ceramics, printed books, and metallurgical products, all of which found eager buyers abroad. The Maritime Silk Road became the primary outlet for these goods, integrating China more deeply into the Indian Ocean world. Technological innovation under the Song also had indirect effects on Silk Road trade. The widespread use of paper money, first introduced in Sichuan during the late Tang but fully developed under the Song, allowed for large transactions without the physical movement of bulky coinage. This made it easier to conduct high-value trade over long distances. The Song also saw improvements in navigation, cartography, and ship design, further strengthening their maritime orientation. The fragmented state of China during this period did have cultural consequences for the Silk Road. With the northern overland routes under the control of non-Chinese dynasties, cultural exchange in that direction was mediated through the political and diplomatic priorities of the Liao, Jin, and Xixia. Buddhism continued to move between China and Central Asia, but now it often did so through the patronage of these northern regimes, rather than directly under Chinese imperial sponsorship. The Jin, for example, supported Buddhist institutions within their territory, including monasteries that served as stopping points for travelers. Diplomatic exchanges also reflected the new multipolar reality. Envoys from Central Asia or the Islamic world might visit both the Jin and the Song courts, negotiating separate agreements with each. This created opportunities for merchants who could act as intermediaries, carrying goods, information, and even artistic influences between realms that did not communicate directly. The eventual rise of the Mongols in the early 13th century would bring these divided regions under a single political authority once again. But in the centuries before their conquests, the Silk Road had already adapted to a world of shifting borders and competing powers. Merchants had learned to work with multiple states, diversify their routes, and exploit the growing maritime connections that linked East Asia to a far wider world. In this sense, the Liao, Jin, and Song period was not a time of decline for the Silk Road, but one of transformation. It demonstrated that the network could survive without a single unifying empire, so long as there were states willing to profit from and protect commerce. The strategies developed during these centuries, balancing overland and maritime trade, using formal border agreements, and relying on intermediary merchant communities, would continue to shape Eurasian commerce even after the political map changed again. In the early 13th century of the Common Era, the political landscape of Eurasia was transformed with astonishing speed. From the Mongolian steppe emerged a force that would, within a few decades, create the largest contiguous land empire in history. Under the leadership of Chinggis Khan, known in the West as Genghis Khan, the Mongols united the fractious tribes of the steppe and launched a series of conquests that brought China, Central Asia, Persia, and large portions of Eastern Europe under their control. For the Silk Road, this was not merely a change in political masters, it was the beginning of a rare historical moment when much of the overland route lay within the borders of a single empire, producing an unprecedented level of security and integration. The Mongols were no strangers to trade. As a nomadic people, they valued portable, high-quality goods and had long engaged in exchange with sedentary neighbors. However, Chinggis Khan and his successors saw commerce not simply as a means of obtaining luxuries, but as a vital tool for governance. A prosperous empire could feed its armies, reward its allies, and keep distant provinces loyal. Recognizing that merchants were essential to this prosperity, the Mongols enacted policies to protect and encourage long-distance trade. One of their most effective innovations was the expansion and refinement of the YAM, or postal relay system. This network of way stations, spaced roughly a day's ride apart, stretched across the empire's vast expanse, from the Yellow River Valley to the Black Sea. At each station, travelers could find fresh horses, supplies, and shelter. Official couriers carrying imperial decrees could change mounts and continue at high speed, covering distances in weeks that might otherwise have taken months. While the YAM was primarily intended for government communication, the Mongols often extended its protections to favored merchants, envoys, and foreign dignitaries. To facilitate trade, the Mongols issued paisa, or tablet passes, to authorized merchants and officials. These inscribed plaques granted the bearer safe conduct and access to the YAM network. They also served as visible proof of imperial protection, deterring bandit attacks and interference from local officials. Merchants holding paisa were often exempt from certain taxes and given priority in obtaining provisions, privileges that encouraged the movement of goods across the empire. The scale of Mongol unification meant that caravans could, for the first time in centuries, travel from China to the Mediterranean without passing through zones of hostile or competing states. Routes that had once been fragmented by political boundaries now formed continuous highways of exchange. Luxury goods such as silk, porcelain, and lacquerware flowed westward, while glassware, silver, textiles, and precious stones moved eastward. Spices from Southeast Asia, furs from Siberia, and horses from the steppes found buyers across the continent. The Mongol Empire's openness to foreign expertise also enhanced the Silk Road's vitality. The Khans actively recruited artisans, engineers, doctors, and administrators from the lands they conquered or with which they traded. This policy not only brought new technologies into the empire, but also encouraged the cross-pollination of ideas. Chinese printing techniques reached Persia, Persian astronomical knowledge traveled to China, and Middle Eastern medical texts were translated for use in East Asia. Religious diversity was another hallmark of Mongol rule. The empire's rulers practiced a form of religious tolerance rare for the time, granting freedom of worship to Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others. This tolerance extended to religious institutions along the Silk Road, which often served as safe havens for travelers. Monasteries, mosques, and churches could be found along major routes, offering food, lodging, and sometimes medical care. Diplomacy under the Mongols was as mobile as their armies. Envoys from Europe, the Islamic world, and East Asia crisscrossed the empire, often using the same relay stations as merchants. Notable among these travelers was the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, whose journeys in the service of the UN court introduced European audiences to the wonders of China. Less well-known, but equally significant, were figures like Rabban Bar Sauma, a Nestorian Christian monk from the Yuan capital of Khanbalik, modern Beijing, who traveled west as an envoy to the courts of Europe. These diplomatic missions often doubled as commercial ventures, carrying valuable goods alongside messages. While the overland Silk Road thrived under Mongol protection, the maritime routes also benefited. The Mongols controlled major Chinese ports such as Quanzhou, and their influence extended to coastal Southeast Asia. This allowed them to integrate sea and land routes into a unified commercial system. A merchant might bring goods from India to a Chinese port, then transfer them to an overland caravan bound for Persia or beyond. The economic prosperity of the Pax Mongolica, literally Mongol peace, was not without costs. The same ease of movement that facilitated trade also allowed diseases to spread rapidly. The most catastrophic example was the Black Death, which moved along both overland and maritime routes in the mid-14th century, devastating populations from China to Europe. The demographic collapse weakened economies, disrupted trade, and eroded the political stability on which the Silk Road depended. Another vulnerability lay in the empire's own political structure. Though vast, the Mongol realm was not a monolithic state, but a collection of khanates, each ruled by a branch of the imperial family. While these khanates initially cooperated, rivalries emerged over time, especially after the death of the great Khan Kublai in the late 13th century. As unity frayed, the ease of movement across Eurasia began to diminish. Nevertheless, the century of Mongol dominance left an enduring legacy for the Silk Road. The infrastructure they built, the policies they enacted, and the cultural connections they fostered would outlast their political control. Merchants and states alike had seen the benefits of integrated trade, and even in periods of fragmentation, they sought to preserve the arteries of exchange the Mongols had revitalized. By the mid-14th century, however, the combined pressures of plague, political division, and environmental challenges were beginning to fracture the system. Trade continued, but the grand vision of a single empire spanning the heart of Eurasia was fading. In its place would emerge a patchwork of regional powers, each seeking to control a portion of the Silk Road and its profits. By the middle of the 14th century of the Common Era, the unprecedented connectivity forged under Mongol rule had made the Silk Road busier than it had been for centuries. Caravans moved freely between the Yuan capital in China and the cities of the Ilkhanate in Persia. Maritime trade linked Chinese ports with Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East, feeding goods into the overland networks. Merchants, envoys, missionaries, and artisans traveled more regularly and across greater distances than perhaps at any other point in the medieval world. Yet this very success created the conditions for one of history's most devastating disasters. The same routes that moved silk, spices, and silver would carry a far deadlier cargo: plague. The disease that came to be known in Europe as the Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by fleas carried on rodents, though in some outbreaks it also spread directly between humans through respiratory droplets. The pathogen had long existed in certain rodent populations of Central Asia, but it had not previously swept across continents in the manner it now would. The integrated trade and travel systems of the Mongol Empire allowed the plague to leapfrog vast distances in a matter of months, reaching regions that had not experienced such outbreaks in living memory. Historical accounts suggest that the plague may have first spread from steppe rodent populations into caravan hubs in northwestern China or the Tarim Basin during the early to mid-14th century. From there, it moved westward along the primary Silk Road corridors, carried by merchants and their pack animals, by soldiers and camp followers, and by the goods themselves, since fleas could hide in bales of cloth or sacks of grain. The relay stations and caravanserais that had been such a boon for trade now became waypoints for contagion, enabling the disease to pass from one group of travelers to the next. One of the most famous episodes linking the plague to the geopolitics of the age occurred during the Mongol siege of the Genoese-controlled port of Kaffa, present-day Feodosia in Crimea, in the year 1346. Contemporary reports claim that plague broke out among the besieging Mongol forces, who then used catapults to hurl infected corpses into the city as a form of early biological warfare. Whether or not this detail is entirely accurate, the siege did coincide with the disease's arrival in Kaffa, from where it was carried by fleeing ships into Mediterranean ports. Within a few years, the plague had reached almost every major city in Europe, as well as much of the Middle East and North Africa. The impact was catastrophic. In many regions, between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population perished within just a few years. Entire villages were abandoned, labor forces collapsed, and agricultural production plummeted. Urban centers, which depended on the constant inflow of food and goods from the countryside, were hit especially hard. The disruption to commerce was immediate. Caravan routes were interrupted. Ports saw fewer ships, and surviving merchants often found markets diminished or buyers bankrupt. In the Islamic world, the plague's effects were similarly devastating. Major cities such as Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad lost large portions of their populations. Chroniclers in these cities recorded the eerie sight of empty streets, shuttered markets, and religious processions seeking divine intervention. In Persia, still recovering from earlier Mongol wars, the demographic blow further weakened political structures. Even regions spared the highest death tolls often suffered economic disruption due to the loss of trading partners and the fear of contagion, which led some rulers to restrict travel or close borders temporarily. In China, the plague struck amid the waning years of the Yuan dynasty. While records from this period are fragmentary, they suggest significant mortality in both urban and rural areas. The combination of epidemic disease, natural disasters, and growing political unrest undermined Mongol authority, contributing to rebellions that would eventually bring the Yuan dynasty to an end. The disruption of trade networks was both a cause and a consequence of this political unraveling. As central authority weakened, maintaining safe and reliable long-distance routes became more difficult. The economic consequences of the Black Death were complex. In the short term, the sharp decline in population meant less demand for certain goods, reducing the profitability of long-distance luxury trade. However, for surviving laborers and artisans, scarcity of workers often translated into higher wages and improved bargaining power. In some areas, the reduced population encouraged technological innovations or shifts in production methods. Still, the overall volume of Silk Road commerce contracted and many routes fell into disuse. The plague also reshaped the geography of trade. Some merchants and states turned more heavily to maritime routes, reasoning that ships, despite their own risks, offered a faster and sometimes more controllable environment than caravans traversing plague-affected regions. This shift did not eliminate the risk of disease spread, as ports could become centers of infection, but it did encourage the development of new sea-based networks that would become increasingly important in later centuries. Culturally, the Black Death left deep marks on the societies of Eurasia. In Europe, it prompted religious and social upheavals, from flagellant movements to waves of persecution against minority communities. In the Islamic world, it led to theological debates about divine will and human agency, as well as renewed interest in medical scholarship. In China, it contributed to the delegitimization of Mongol rule and the rise of native-led movements that culminated in the Ming Dynasty. Across these varied contexts, the memory of the plague shaped attitudes toward travel, trade, and foreign contact for generations. From the perspective of Silk Road history, the Black Death marked the abrupt end of the Mongol-era integration that had so recently seemed unshakable. The same factors that had made the overland network so vibrant, secure routes, political unity, and high volumes of travel, had also made it uniquely vulnerable to a pandemic. Once the disease had swept through, the political map of Eurasia was left fractured, populations diminished, and trust in long-distance contact eroded. Yet even in the midst of this collapse, some threads of the Silk Road endured. Local and regional trade persisted, and in some cases adapted to the new realities. Caravans still crossed Central Asia, though more sporadically and often under the protection of smaller, regional powers rather than a single great empire. Ports along the maritime routes continued to handle goods, though often at reduced scale. The underlying desire for connection, whether for commerce, diplomacy, or cultural exchange, remained. In the decades following the plague, new powers would rise to fill the vacuum left by the Mongols. One of the most formidable among them would be the Timurid Empire, forged by a conqueror whose campaigns would both devastate and rejuvenate key parts of the Silk Road. In the wake of the Black Death and the collapse of Mongol unity, Central Asia became a fragmented landscape of rival khanates, tribal confederations, and weakened urban centers. Into this unsettled world stepped a conqueror whose ambition rivaled that of Chinggis Khan, but whose legacy was as much about cultural splendor as military devastation. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, rose from the Barlas clan of Transoxiana in the latter half of the 14th century and forged an empire that stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the gates of the Ottoman capital. Timur was not a descendant of Chinggis Khan, but he skillfully invoked the Mongol legacy to legitimize his rule. Claiming to act in the name of Chinggisid princes while marrying into their lineage, he presented himself as both a restorer of Mongol authority and a champion of Islamic civilization. His capital at Samarkand became both the nerve center of his military campaigns and the jewel of his cultural ambitions. Militarily, Timur's campaigns were extraordinary in scale and ferocity. Over the course of several decades, he led armies deep into Persia, India, the Caucasus, Anatolia, and the steppes north of the Aral Sea. Cities that resisted him, such as Delhi, Baghdad, and Aleppo, often suffered catastrophic destruction. Populations were slaughtered or deported, and urban economies were thrown into chaos. The disruption to Silk Road commerce was immediate and severe in some regions, as trade hubs were depopulated or subjected to heavy tribute. Yet even as Timur's conquests disrupted existing trade, his empire also created conditions for renewed commercial activity, at least within the territories he controlled. His campaigns often spared artisans, architects, and scholars, whom he forcibly relocated to Samarkand and other favored cities. This influx of skilled workers transformed Samarkand into a center of architectural innovation, craftsmanship, and learning. Monumental buildings such as the Bibi Kanyim Mosque and the Registan Ensemble combined Persian, Central Asian, and Mongol elements, projecting an image of Timur's rule as both powerful and cultured. The Timurids understood that their political and economic strength depended on controlling the key nodes of regional trade. Samarkand, situated on the route between China and the Middle East, was ideally placed to serve as a Silk Road hub. Caravanserais were repaired or newly built to encourage merchants to pass through the city, and markets were stocked with goods from across Eurasia. While Timur's conquests made some routes unsafe, the areas under his firm control benefited from increased security and centralized oversight. One striking feature of Timurid economic policy was its emphasis on patronage. Timur and his successors invested heavily in public works, including madrasas, gardens, and mausoleums. This patronage not only displayed their wealth and piety, but also created a favorable environment for artisans and traders. Foreign envoys and merchants were received with elaborate ceremony, reinforcing Samarkand's reputation as a cosmopolitan capital. Culturally, the Timurid period represented a kind of renaissance in Central Asia. Timur's grandson, Ulugh Beg, became one of the most renowned rulers of the 15th century, not for military conquests, but for his scholarship. As governor of Samarkand, and later as supreme ruler, Ulugh Beg established one of the greatest observatories of the medieval Islamic world. The Ulugh Beg Observatory produced highly accurate astronomical tables that would influence science from the Middle East to India and beyond. This blending of conquest and culture meant that the Timurid realm functioned both as a zone of danger and as a magnet for talent. Merchants adapted to the political realities, sometimes rerouting caravans to avoid unstable frontiers, but still seeking to access the lucrative markets of Samarkand, Herat, and other Timurid cities. The court's patronage of the arts, sciences, and architecture created demand for luxury goods, while the ruler's desire for prestige encouraged the import of rare and exotic items. The Timurids also maintained active diplomatic contacts with distant powers. Envoys traveled between Samarkand and the Ming court in China, exchanging gifts and negotiating terms for trade. Similar missions reached the Ottoman Empire and even some European states, including the Kingdom of Castile. These exchanges were not purely ceremonial. They provided opportunities for merchants to accompany diplomatic missions, carrying goods under the protection of high-status envoys. However, the Timurid Empire faced structural weaknesses. Like many empires built by charismatic conquerors, it struggled to maintain unity after Timur's death in the year 1405. Rivalries among his descendants, combined with the difficulty of governing a sprawling and diverse territory, led to fragmentation. Some regions fell to emerging powers such as the Uzbeks in Central Asia or the Safavids in Persia, while others became effectively independent under local Timurid princes. Despite this political decline, the cultural achievements of the Timurid period had a lasting impact. Herat, under the rule of Timur's son Shah Rukh and daughter-in-law Gauhar Shad, became a major center of Persian literature, miniature painting, and architectural design. The artistic and scholarly traditions fostered in Timurid courts would influence the Safavid, Mughal, and Ottoman empires, ensuring that Timur's legacy endured far beyond his political reign. In terms of Silk Road history, the Timurids represent a transitional phase. They did not create the kind of continent-wide unity achieved under the Mongols, and their conquests often damaged the very cities that formed the lifeblood of Eurasian trade. Yet their emphasis on urban development, patronage, and diplomacy meant that certain routes and markets flourished under their control. The splendor of Samarkand and Herat during this era became legendary, inspiring travelers and chroniclers across the Islamic world and Europe. The Timurid period also underscores a recurring pattern in Silk Road history: the tension between war and commerce. Military campaigns could devastate trade in the short term, but the consolidation of power, when paired with investment in infrastructure and cultural patronage, could also revive and even expand commercial networks. For the merchants of the 15th century, navigating the Timurid world meant balancing these risks and rewards, adapting routes and partnerships to the shifting fortunes of the empire. By the late 15th century, the balance of power in Eurasia was shifting again. Maritime trade was expanding rapidly, driven by new navigational technologies and the ambitions of European seafaring states. Overland routes still mattered, but they faced increasing competition from sea lanes that could carry bulk goods more cheaply and quickly. In this changing environment, the great land empires of the early modern period, Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal, would each seek to control what remained of the Silk Road's overland arteries, even as European ships began to dominate the global flow of goods. By the late 15th century of the Common Era, the Silk Road as it had existed for centuries was entering a new phase. The familiar pattern of caravans crossing deserts and mountains persisted, but the balance of global trade was shifting toward the sea. European maritime powers, equipped with improved navigation, larger ships, and increasingly global ambitions, were beginning to link the Atlantic directly to Asia. At the same time, three great land-based Islamic empires, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, emerged as dominant forces in the regions that had once been the heart of overland Eurasian commerce. The Ottoman Empire, rising from its Anatolian base, captured Constantinople in the year 1453 and transformed it into the imperial capital of Istanbul. This victory not only ended the Byzantine Empire, but also gave the Ottomans control over key points connecting Europe to Asia. The empire's territory stretched across the eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, Anatolia, and into the Middle East, including much of the old caravan route between the Levant and Persia. Ottoman policy toward trade was complex. On the one hand, the empire profited from taxing goods that passed through its domains, maintaining caravanserais and protecting merchants. Cities like Aleppo and Damascus thrived as entrepôts for goods arriving from Persia and the Arabian Peninsula. On the other hand, the Ottomans were wary of European influence and competition, especially as Portuguese and later Dutch and English ships began to bring Asian goods directly to European ports by sea. This maritime bypass reduced the volume of high-value goods moving through the overland Levantine routes, diminishing one of the empire's traditional sources of revenue. To the east of the Ottomans, the Safavid Empire arose in Persia at the dawn of the 16th century. Under Shah Ismail and his successors, the Safavids established a powerful centralized state with Shia Islam as its official religion, setting them apart from their Sunni Ottoman rivals. The Safavid capital at Isfahan became a dazzling center of architecture, art, and trade. The city's covered bazaars offered silks, carpets, ceramics, and spices to merchants from as far away as India and the Mediterranean. The Safavids controlled critical stretches of the overland Silk Road running through Persia, but they faced geopolitical challenges. Their frequent wars with the Ottomans disrupted caravan traffic across the Anatolian plateau. At the same time, Portuguese control of Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf in the early 16th century threatened Persian access to maritime trade. The Safavids responded by fostering overland routes through the Caucasus and Central Asia, while also seeking alternative maritime outlets, such as the port of Bandar Abbas, after wresting Hormuz from the Portuguese in the early 17th century. Farther east, the Mughal Empire emerged in the early 16th century, founded by Babur, a descendant of both Timur and Chinggis Khan. Centered in the rich agricultural lands of northern India, the Mughal realm became one of the wealthiest and most populous states of the early modern world. Its cities, Agra, Lahore, and later Delhi, were major centers of manufacturing and trade. The Mughals exported fine cotton textiles, indigo, sugar, and precious stones, importing horses, Central Asian goods, and luxury items from Persia and beyond. The Mughals benefited from both overland and maritime connections. While caravan routes linked them to Central Asia through Kabul and Kandahar, maritime routes carried their goods to the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. Portuguese, Dutch, and English ships increasingly docked at Indian ports, purchasing textiles and spices in exchange for silver from the Americas, which had entered global circulation through European colonial networks. This integration of the Indian Ocean into global trade networks marked a decisive change for the Silk Road. Silver mined in the Americas was shipped to Europe, then to Asia, especially to Mughal India and Ming China, where it was in high demand for currency. The maritime routes were faster and capable of carrying bulk goods in quantities impossible for caravans. While certain high-value, low-weight items like fine silk could still be moved profitably overland, the economic center of gravity was tilting toward the sea. The rivalry among the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals shaped this transitional period. Political boundaries and military conflicts could interrupt specific overland routes, forcing merchants to adapt. A caravan traveling from India to the Mediterranean might have to negotiate with Mughal officials, pass through Safavid Persia with its own customs duties, and then enter Ottoman territory before reaching the Levant. This chain of jurisdictions added both costs and risks, making maritime alternatives even more attractive. Nevertheless, the overland Silk Road did not vanish. In many regions, it continued to serve important roles in regional trade and cultural exchange. Pilgrimage routes to Mecca, diplomatic missions, and the movement of specialized goods, such as thoroughbred horses from Central Asia, still relied on overland paths. For many communities along these routes, caravan trade remained a vital economic lifeline, even if it no longer commanded the same global significance it had in earlier centuries. Culturally, The 15th to 17th centuries saw continued cross-pollination along both land and sea routes. The Ottomans exchanged architectural ideas with Italian city-states. The Safavids blended Persian, Central Asian, and Ottoman influences in art and textiles. And the Mughals fused Persianate court culture with Indian traditions to create their own distinctive style. Artistic motifs, musical instruments, and culinary tastes traveled between these empires, often carried by the same merchants and artisans who moved goods for sale. European maritime expansion both competed with and complemented the trade of these Islamic empires. Portuguese, Dutch, and English merchants sometimes traded directly in Ottoman, Safavid, or Mughal ports, bypassing traditional intermediaries, but they also purchased goods that had moved overland to these ports. In this way, even as the sea routes gained dominance, the Silk Road remained entangled in the emerging global economy. By the late 17th century, the combined effects of European maritime dominance, shifting political borders, and changing economic patterns meant that the overland Silk Road had been reduced to a smaller, though still significant part of global trade. The caravan cities that had once thrived as major hubs now relied more on regional commerce, and the great transcontinental journeys of earlier centuries became less frequent. Yet the legacy of the Silk Road persisted in the cities, cultures, and political systems that had grown up along its paths. By the early 18th century of the Common Era, the overland Silk Road was no longer the primary engine of intercontinental commerce. Maritime routes, now firmly dominated by European naval powers, carried the bulk of goods between Asia, Europe, and Africa. Yet the old caravan paths across Central Asia retained strategic importance. They linked frontier garrisons, sustained regional economies, and remained channels for cultural and political influence. In this period, two empires in particular, the Qing dynasty in China and the Russian Empire, expanded into Central Asia, redrawing boundaries and reshaping the geography of these historic routes. The Qing dynasty, having consolidated control over China proper, turned its attention westward. Under the reigns of the Kangxi, Yongjing, and Qianlong emperors, the Qing launched a series of military campaigns that brought the vast region of Xinjiang, then a mosaic of oasis kingdoms, nomadic confederations, and Dzungar Mongol domains, under imperial authority. These campaigns, culminating in the destruction of the Dzungar Khanate in the mid-18th century, were among the largest frontier operations in Qing history. Qing administration in Xinjiang was a complex blend of military occupation and indirect rule. The dynasty established garrisons, appointed local leaders as imperial agents, and maintained a network of fortified posts to secure routes through the Tarim Basin and the Dzungarian steppe. Although the old east-west trade through the region had diminished compared to earlier centuries, the Qing recognized Xinjiang's importance as a buffer zone against Central Asian and Russian encroachment. They also sought to control the flow of goods, such as jade, horses, and cotton, which were still valuable in regional markets. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire was expanding southward and eastward from its heartlands in Eastern Europe and Siberia. Beginning in the 17th century with the conquest of Siberia, the Russians steadily moved into the Kazakh steppe, establishing forts and trading posts. By the 18th century, Russian power reached the edges of Central Asia, where they competed indirectly with the Qing for influence over the steppe nomads and the caravan routes connecting them to China. Trade between the Qing and Russia became formalized under treaties such as the Treaty of Kyakhta in the early 18th century, which designated the town of Kyakhta as the official point of exchange. From this border post, Russian merchants brought furs, metals, and manufactured goods to trade for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. This tea trade in particular grew to immense proportions, with camel caravans carrying compressed tea bricks across the Mongolian steppe to Siberia, from where they were shipped to markets in St. Petersburg and beyond. The Qing-Russian frontier trade illustrates how, even in an era dominated by maritime commerce, overland exchange retained certain niches of profitability. Tea, being relatively light, durable, and highly in demand, was well suited to long-distance caravan transport. The Russian market's growing appetite for tea sustained the route for more than a century, providing livelihoods for merchants, camel drivers, and steppe intermediaries. While these two empires consolidated control over much of the Silk Road's heartland, European colonial powers, particularly Britain, were becoming more involved in Central Asian affairs. This interest was partly strategic, as Britain sought to protect its Indian possessions from perceived threats emanating from the north. The resulting geopolitical rivalry, often called the Great Game, pitted Britain and Russia against each other in a contest for influence over Afghanistan, Persia, and the Central Asian Khanates. Though the Great Game was primarily a diplomatic and military struggle, it also involved control over trade corridors and the flow of information along old Silk Road routes. The 19th century also saw advances in transportation technology that would further transform the old caravan paths. The construction of the Trans-Caspian Railway by Russia in the late 19th century and the Trans-Siberian Railway, begun in the 1890s, provided faster, more reliable connections across Eurasia. These railways often bypassed traditional caravan routes, undermining the economies of towns that had once thrived on overland trade. Yet they also revived certain connections in a new form, allowing bulk goods to move inland more efficiently than before. It was during this same century that the very idea of the Silk Road as a historical concept began to take shape. The German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen is credited with coining the term Seidenstraße, Silk Road, in the 1860s. Richthofen used it to describe the ancient network of trade routes linking China to the Mediterranean, though in his own time much of this network was either defunct or functioning only in limited regional capacities. His writings, and those of subsequent explorers and scholars, sparked European interest in the archaeology and history of Central Asia. This scholarly curiosity led to a wave of expeditions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Figures such as Sven Hedin of Sweden, Aurel Stein of Britain, and Paul Pelliot of France traveled through the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, uncovering ruins, manuscripts, and artifacts from the heyday of the Silk Road. Their discoveries revealed the cosmopolitan character of the ancient trade routes, where Buddhist cave temples, Persian texts, and Chinese paintings coexisted in the same archaeological layers. While these expeditions expanded academic understanding, they also reflected the imperial attitudes of the time. Many of the artifacts recovered were removed to European museums, often without the consent of local authorities. This extraction mirrored the broader dynamic of imperial control over Central Asia, where local communities had limited say in how their cultural heritage and economic resources were managed. By the end of the 19th century, the Silk Road was no longer a dominant artery of global trade, but it had become a powerful symbol. For Qing China, it represented both the historical reach of Chinese civilization and the strategic importance of the Western regions. For Russia, it was part of the imperial frontier, rich in resources and a gateway to Asia. For European scholars and the reading public, it was a romantic vision of camel caravans crossing vast deserts laden with silks and spices. This shift, from lived economic reality to historical and geopolitical metaphor, would set the stage for the Silk Road's 20th century transformations. In the following decades, revolutions, colonial withdrawals, and the rise of the Soviet Union would close many of the old borders, replacing the fluid exchanges of earlier centuries with rigid state-controlled frontiers. Yet the name Silk Road would endure, ready to be revived in new contexts when political and economic circumstances changed again. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Silk Road was no longer a seamless artery of commerce linking China to the Mediterranean. The rise of nation-states, imperial competition, and the accelerating development of modern transportation had fractured the network into disconnected regional pathways. Political borders were now heavily policed, and new technologies, railways, steamships, and later aviation, channeled most long-distance trade along routes that bypassed the great caravan trails. Yet the legacy of the Silk Road lingered in the memory of the peoples who lived along its course, and in the strategic imaginations of states that controlled its fragments. The Russian Revolution of 1917 and the subsequent creation of the Soviet Union had a profound impact on Central Asia, a region that had once been the heartland of the overland Silk Road. The new Soviet authorities incorporated the Central Asian khanates and steppe territories into socialist republics, redrawing boundaries to create the administrative units that would later become independent nations. These changes were accompanied by a program of political centralization, collectivization of agriculture, and the development of new transportation networks designed to serve Soviet industrial and military needs rather than traditional trade patterns. Cross-border trade with China and the Middle East was tightly restricted. The Soviet state controlled all formal economic exchanges, and the free movement of merchants that had characterized earlier centuries virtually disappeared. The ancient oasis cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar lost their role as international trading hubs, becoming instead regional centers within closed economic systems. Roads and railways linked them to Moscow and other Soviet cities. But the flow of goods and people across the old Silk Road frontiers was minimal. In China, the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 and the subsequent decades of warlordism, civil war, and Japanese invasion similarly disrupted the old trade routes. The establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 brought political stability, but also a central government that, like the Soviets, imposed tight control over frontier trade. Xinjiang, incorporated into the new Chinese state, became both a strategic military zone and a site for state-led economic development. Its connections to Central Asia remained limited, as China's foreign policy during much of the Cold War favored self-reliance and cautious engagement with its neighbors. The Cold War further deepened the divide across Central Asia. The Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s closed even the limited border crossings between the Soviet Union and China, effectively severing the eastern and western halves of the overland Silk Road. Trade and communication between the two great socialist powers were rerouted through third countries or reduced to symbolic levels. The once fluid exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures was replaced by mutual suspicion and heavily fortified borders. Yet even during these decades of closure, elements of the Silk Road persisted in altered forms. Internal trade networks within the Soviet Union and China maintained some of the east-west flows, albeit entirely under state supervision. Academic exchanges and cultural diplomacy occasionally bridged the gap, especially during periods of détente. Archaeological interest in the Silk Road grew, with Soviet and Chinese scholars studying and restoring historic monuments, sometimes as part of broader campaigns to highlight the achievements of their respective civilizations. The late 20th century brought dramatic changes. The gradual thawing of the Cold War in the 1980s, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, transformed the political map of Eurasia. Newly independent states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan, emerged in Central Asia, reclaiming their sovereignty and seeking to redefine their place in the regional and global economy. Borders that had been sealed for decades began to open, and the possibility of renewed overland trade between China, Central Asia, and the Middle East re-emerged. China, undergoing rapid economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping, began to look westward as part of its broader strategy of opening to the world. Xinjiang became a focal point for cross-border commerce, with new trade agreements signed with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and other neighbors. Markets in border towns like Khorgos and Kashgar revived, drawing traders from across Central Asia. Goods such as textiles, electronics, and consumer products began flowing along new road and rail links, often following routes that echoed ancient caravan paths. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, infrastructure development became central to the reinvention of the Silk Road. Highways, pipelines, and railways began to knit together regions that had long been divided. The completion of the Trans-Asian Railway segments, linking China to Central Asia and onward to Europe, marked a symbolic and practical step toward reviving overland freight transport. Container trains could now travel from eastern China to Western Europe in a matter of weeks, offering an alternative to maritime shipping for certain goods. This revival was not purely economic. Tourism emerged as a significant force in reimagining the Silk Road. Governments in Central Asia and China promoted their historic cities and archaeological sites as part of a shared Silk Road heritage. UNESCO designations for cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and the Mogao Caves in Dunhuang highlighted their global cultural significance. Travelers from around the world came to walk through ancient bazaars, visit restored mosques and caravanserais, and trace the paths of merchants and pilgrims from centuries past. The 21st century saw China launch its most ambitious Silk Road-themed initiative yet, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, announced in 2013. This vast program of infrastructure investment aims to connect China to Europe, Africa, and the rest of Asia through both overland belt routes and maritime road routes. While the BRI is motivated by a complex mix of economic, strategic, and political goals, its branding explicitly draws on the imagery of the ancient Silk Road, presenting China as a modern driver of global connectivity. Under the BRI, rail links between China and Europe have multiplied, with freight services carrying electronics, machinery, textiles, and other goods across Kazakhstan, Russia, and Belarus to destinations in Germany, Poland, and beyond. Pipelines transport oil and gas from Central Asia to Chinese markets. Roads, bridges, and tunnels have been built or upgraded along key corridors, while ports from the South China Sea to the Mediterranean have received Chinese investment. At the same time, the modern Silk Road operates in a world vastly different from that of its historical predecessor. Digital technology allows for the near-instant transmission of information, contracts, and payments, making the movement of goods more efficient, but also reducing the relative importance of physical trade routes for certain forms of exchange. Air freight offers another alternative to sea or land, further diversifying the logistics landscape. The reinvention of the Silk Road in the contemporary era has also been met with challenges. Political instability, regional rivalries, and concerns over debt and sovereignty have complicated some BRI projects. Environmental issues, such as the sustainability of infrastructure and the impact of increased transport on fragile ecosystems, have drawn criticism. In some areas, the influx of foreign investment has sparked debates over cultural preservation and local control. Nevertheless, the concept of the Silk Road remains powerful in the global imagination. It evokes centuries of human connection across vast distances, the mingling of cultures, and the exchange of ideas as much as the movement of goods. For policymakers, it offers a framework for cooperation and development. For businesses, it suggests opportunities in emerging markets. For travelers, it conjures images of camel caravans, bustling bazaars, and architectural splendor. Today's Silk Road is thus both a physical reality, expressed in highways, rail lines, and shipping routes, and a symbolic construct, used to frame international partnerships and to promote tourism, cultural exchange, and historical identity. Its modern incarnation may not perfectly replicate the economic and social systems of the past, but it draws on that past to shape visions of the future. From the step tracks of Bronze Age herders to the fiber optic cables of the digital age, the Silk Road's story is one of constant adaptation. Political boundaries have shifted, technologies have transformed, and the balance between land and sea has tilted back and forth. Yet, through all these changes, the idea of connection, the linking of distant peoples through trade, culture, and mutual curiosity, remains at its core. The journey of the Silk Road, stretching across millennia, reminds us that history is not a straight line, but a web of paths, some forgotten, others rediscovered, and still others newly forged. In the modern era, the Silk Road lives on not only in the landscapes of Central Asia and the ports of the Indian Ocean, but also in the shared human impulse to reach beyond the horizon, seeking exchange, understanding, and opportunity.